The building at the end of Diagon Alley is the oldest structure still standing in Wizarding Britain. White marble, scrubbed clean every morning by goblins who take no particular pride in the appearance but tolerate no visible grime. Because grime suggests neglect, and neglect suggests weakness, and weakness is not something Gringotts Wizarding Bank has displayed in over 500 years of continuous operation. 2 sets of doors guard the entrance, bronze ones first, then silver ones a few feet beyond. Between them, carved into the stone, a poem. Most visitors read it in about 30 seconds, and promptly forget it. The goblins, working behind the counters inside, already know whether any given visitor is going to remember it or not. Past the silver doors, the marble floor spreads outward, enormous and immaculate. The ceiling vaults upward, at a height that feels wrong for a building that looked modest from outside. Torchlight plays across it. The sounds of money being counted, weighed, and sorted form a constant low murmur. At the counters that run along both sides of the hall, goblin tellers are working. They do not look up when a wizard walks in. Not because they are busy, exactly, and not from hostility or indifference. They simply have things in front of them that require more attention than a passing client does, and those things are more interesting. Every significant wizard family in Britain has vault access here. Every ministry budget cycle draws on treasury funds that move through Gringotts. Every international trade in wizarding goods and services gets denominated in galleons that goblins mint. Every piece of magical currency that changes hands in the British wizarding world, from the cost of a Quidditch ticket to the purchase price of a dragon, touches a system that goblins designed, goblins built, and goblins have been running without interruption since the 1400s. That is the part of the Gringotts story that rarely gets told directly. The bank gets described as a service, as something goblins provide to the wizarding world in exchange for a working relationship and modest political accommodations. That description captures the surface arrangement and misses the structure underneath it. An institution that holds the wealth of an entire civilization, controls its currency, operates beyond government oversight, and has maintained unbroken continuity through multiple wars and political collapses, is not providing a service in any ordinary commercial sense. It is the financial infrastructure that everything else stands on. Whoever controls that infrastructure controls more than anyone who comes to use it fully appreciates. Tonight we are going to go through all of it. The goblin world before Gringotts existed, the deal that created the bank and what each side understood that deal to mean, the underground geography most wizards never see, the vault system, the security mechanisms, the rebellions, the craftsmanship traditions, the ownership dispute that has been running for 5 centuries, the heist that should have been impossible, the occupation that tested every claim about neutrality, and the aftermath that resolved almost nothing. By the end, the question of who runs the wizarding world will look different than the story's surface usually suggests. If you are settling in for the night, find your position. This will take a while. There is a particular quality to the silence in Gringotts that is different from the silence in other large official spaces. The Ministry of Magic atrium is loud in its own way, populated by the rustle of memos and the hum of enchanted lighting and the sound of hundreds of employees moving through their workday. Hogwarts is never quite silent, because a castle full of children never is. Gringotts has a silence that is purposeful. The sounds present there are the sounds of work, the clink of coin, the scratch of quill on parchment, the low professional exchanges between goblin tellers and the clients standing at their counters. The sounds that are absent are the sounds of display. There is nothing in Gringotts designed to impress you beyond the marble itself, and the marble does its work through mass and permanence rather than ornamentation. This quality of purposeful restraint, of an institution that has nothing to prove because it has already proved everything it needs to prove, is part of what makes Gringotts feel different from wizard institutions that emphasize their own importance. The ministry announces itself. Hogwarts announces itself. Gringotts simply exists, with the confidence of 500 years of continuous operation behind it, and waits for you to come to it, because you will. You always do. Everyone does. The goblins who work in the main hall are mostly young to middle-aged by goblin standards, which covers a wider range of years than the human equivalent. Senior goblin management operates at depths that most clients never reach, in offices in the upper underground levels that visitors do not see. The visible workforce is not the full picture of goblin institutional structure, which has layers of management, specialization, and institutional hierarchy that are as complex as any large wizard organization and considerably better documented, at least internally. Before we get into it, if you are new here, the subscribe button is right below this video. Deep dive lore explorations like this one go out regularly, and if a calm voice going through wizarding history is something that helps you sleep, this channel is built for that. If you have been here before, welcome back. Drop a comment with what you think is the most underrated goblin moment in the entire series. We will be covering a lot of territory tonight, and your take is worth hearing. For now, into the history. Chapter 1. Who goblins actually are. Goblins appear in the Harry Potter series early and are, for most of the story, background furniture. They are at the counters when Harry converts Muggle money to wizarding currency for the first time in his life. They guide the cart on the underground railway. They count gold in the vaults. For a species that controls the financial infrastructure of an entire civilization, they receive very little sustained attention across the first 5 books. When the 6th arrives and things grow darker, goblins are mentioned as a political concern, as a group whose allegiance in the coming conflict is uncertain and important. By the 7th book, when a goblin named Grip Hook becomes central to the plot, most readers had spent 6 volumes absorbing very little about what goblins are, what they want, or what they have been building for the past 500 years. The physical description that the books provide is not designed to invite empathy. Goblins are short, noticeably shorter than adult humans, with heads that seem too large for the bodies below them. Their fingers are long, their skin runs toward brown and grey rather than any tone that reads as warm in the cultural shorthand of fantasy description. Their eyes are dark and sharp. The adjective the narrative reaches for most consistently when describing goblin expressions is shrewd, not intelligent, not perceptive, not curious, shrewd. The word carries a specific connotation, cleverness, in service of self-interest, calculation rather than wisdom. Every physical and behavioral description of goblins in the series is filtered through a perspective that was formed by centuries of wizard assumptions before Harry ever walked into Gringotts. The question of how goblins see themselves is almost entirely absent from the main narrative, which is written from Harry's perspective and is therefore limited to what Harry knows, or what he overhears, or what someone explains to him. What Harry knows about goblins when the series begins is what any wizard child would know. They run the bank, they are shrewd, they are not entirely to be trusted. And there have been goblin rebellions at various points in history that the Ministry of Magic eventually managed to suppress. This body of knowledge is accurate in its facts and misleading in its framing. It describes what goblins have done from a wizard perspective without explaining why, and the why is where the actual history lives. The classification of magical creatures in wizarding lore runs on a distinction that sounds administrative and carries significant political weight. You are either a being or a beast. Beings have legal standing. They can petition the Ministry of Magic, make formal complaints, participate in governance to the extent that wizard law permits, and have their interests recognized as interests rather than as management problems. Beasts do not have any of those things. They are managed, protected in some cases, regulated in others, but not heard. The line between those two categories has been contested across the entire history of wizarding Britain, and goblins have been on both sides of it at different points depending on which ministry administration was in power and what political pressures that administration was navigating. The argument for classifying goblins as beasts rather than beings was never made honestly. It was always framed as a behavioral judgment. Goblins were too violent, too resistant to authority, too unwilling to accept the governance structures of wizard society to be trusted with the rights that being status conferred. The logic, if you follow it carefully, runs in a circle. Goblins were rebellious. Rebelliousness proved they could not be trusted with rights. The absence of rights made rebellion more likely. Rebellion was then cited as the reason rights could not be granted. No one in the official record of ministry debates on the question ever acknowledged this structure directly, because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging that the classification system was designed to maintain a particular power arrangement rather than to accurately describe the nature of the creatures being classified. By the time the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures formally debated being status in the early decades of the ministry's existence, goblins had been living alongside wizards for at least a millennium. Evidence of goblin settlements in Britain predates the founding of Hogwarts in the late 900s. Old wizarding chronicles, the kind that survive in private collections and in the restricted section of Hogwarts library rather than in textbooks, contain references to goblin communities in the northern uplands of England, in the Welsh mountains, in the chalk downs of the south, operating entirely outside wizard settlements and maintaining their own systems of governance, trade, record-keeping, and magical practice. These communities were not primitive. That point requires saying explicitly because the narrative convenience of the Harry Potter series, in which non-human magical beings occupy roles defined by what they provide to human wizards rather than by what they are or what they might choose independently, works consistently against the reader understanding goblin civilization as something separate and sophisticated, rather than as a service tradition that developed in response to wizard demand. What goblin civilization was, before centuries of political pressure compressed it into the form most visible today, is a matter of inference from fragments, rather than a complete historical record. Goblins maintained control of their own history in their own language, which is both why goblin records are not available to wizard scholars, and why goblin institutional memory is more complete than most wizards realize. What we can infer from the physical evidence, the objects that survive, the architectural traditions, the craft knowledge, is a civilization that had developed highly sophisticated metallurgical practices long before wand-based magic existed in anything like its current form. Goblin settlements included forges operating at temperatures that ordinary wizard fire-making spells cannot reach. The alloys produced in those forges have properties that wizard metallurgists have been trying to understand and replicate for centuries without success. Goblin magic is the feature of Goblin civilization that most confounds wizard assumptions. Because wizard thinking about magic is structured around the wand as the primary instrument, you learn to use a wand at Hogwarts. You cast spells through a wand. The history of magic that wizards study is a history of wand development, wand technique, wand regulation, and the various theories about what wands do and why. The possibility that magic could work through fundamentally different mechanisms, not as a supplement to wand magic, but as a parallel tradition with its own principles, is something wizard education does not prepare students to think about clearly. Goblins do not use wands. They have never used wands. The Ministry of Magic passed legislation forbidding non-wizard beings from carrying wands at various points in the 17th century, which presupposed that the natural state of affairs was one in which goblins might want wands and had to be prevented from having them. The actual relationship between goblins and wands is more complicated. Goblins appear to have regarded wands as instruments suited to a different style of magical practice than their own, not as superior tools they were being denied, but as alternatives to a tradition they already had. The prohibition on wand carrying was offensive to goblins, not primarily because they desperately wanted wands, but because the prohibition communicated, in the clearest possible terms, that they were not trusted with the primary tool of wizard magical capacity, and therefore not equal to wizards in any practical sense. What goblins do instead of wand magic can be seen in every piece of their craft and in every security system at Gringotts. Goblin enchantments are not applied to objects after the fact, the way a wizard might cast a protection charm on a piece of equipment. They are built into the object during its creation, woven through the physical substance of the material at the molecular level, in a process that requires simultaneous physical craftsmanship and magical intention working in the same motion. This is why goblin-made objects cannot be replicated by wizard smiths who have studied them. The final product of goblin metalworking looks like metalwork, and some of its physical properties can be measured and described. But the magical component is not a layer added on top of the physical object. It is part of what the object is, baked in from the moment of its making, and there is no technique in wizard education that teaches how to do this because no one outside goblin craft traditions knows how it works. The practical consequence of this tradition is that goblin-made objects have properties that nothing else in the wizarding world can match. Goblin silver, the most famous material in this tradition, is not the silver that appears in Muggle metalworking. The composition, the alloying process, the conditions under which it is worked, all of these involve knowledge that goblins have maintained as proprietary for as long as the tradition has existed. Goblin silver can absorb substances and properties from things it comes into contact with without being diminished by them, a quality that becomes critically important when we get to the story of the Sword of Gryffindor. It does not corrode under ordinary magical decay. It does not melt at temperatures that would destroy wizard-made metals. Pieces of goblin silver kept in Hogwarts collections for 800 years show none of the degradation that affects comparable wizard-made objects stored under similar conditions. The language goblins speak among themselves, called gobbledygook in wizard parlance, has no widely distributed written form accessible to wizards. Hogwarts does not teach it. The Ministry of Magic employs goblin translators for formal negotiations, but the number of wizards who can actually speak gobbledygook at any functional level is small. All internal Gringotts documentation, every vault record, every security protocol, every transaction ledger, every internal communication between goblin staff is in gobbledygook. This is not merely a practical arrangement reflecting goblin preference, it is a fundamental feature of how Gringotts operates as an institution. The Ministry of Magic cannot audit Gringotts independently, because doing so would require either mass hiring goblin translators who answer to Gringotts management, or somehow obtaining and deciphering documents in a language whose written form wizards do not have access to. The operational security of the entire banking institution is built partly on the inaccessibility of its records to any outside party. All of this, the craft traditions, the independent magical practice, the language barrier, the history of settlements predating the founding of wizard institutions, adds up to a civilization that made a series of calculated decisions over several centuries about how to maintain its most important capabilities while adapting to a political reality in which wizard governance was becoming increasingly dominant. The bank is the most visible outcome of those decisions. It is not the whole picture, but it is the part of the picture that has mattered most in the political economy of the wizarding world for the past 500 years. And understanding what the bank is built on requires understanding that it was built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The formal history of how goblins achieved being status, lost it, regained it, and then operated within it with continuous dissatisfaction is a thread that runs through the entire period from the founding of the Wizards' Council to the modern ministry. The Wizards' Council, which predated the ministry and was considerably less organized, appears to have treated the beings versus beasts question on a case-by-case basis, adjusting classifications in response to immediate political pressures rather than any consistent philosophical basis. When goblin communities were quiet, they were sometimes granted being status to manage diplomatic relations. When goblin communities became active in asserting their interests, they were reclassified as beasts to legally justify whatever suppressive response the council had decided to take. This pattern was not limited to goblins. The classification history of centaurs, werewolves, and merpeople across the same period shows similar fluctuations tied to political convenience rather than any stable principle. But the goblin situation was distinctive because of the banking. Goblins who were classified as beasts were still operating the financial institution that the entire wizarding economy depended on. The legal classification said they lacked the standing of persons. The economic reality said they held the keys to every vault in Britain. The tension between these two facts was never resolved by the Wizards' Council and was only partially addressed by the early ministry, which granted being status in the 1707 settlement, but withheld the practical rights that would have made the classification meaningful. The goblin response to this situation was complex in ways that the books do not fully show because the books are not interested in goblin internal politics except as context for Harry's situation. What can be inferred is that different goblin communities had different assessments of how to respond to the being status question and the political situation it created. Some prioritized working within the system, maintaining relations with wizard governance, attempting to use the formal channels the ministry offered. Others maintained that formal channels were designed to produce the appearance of engagement without the substance of change, and that the bank was a more reliable source of long-term leverage than petitions to the Committee for Goblin Liaison. The history suggests the second view proved more accurate, but both traditions appear to have been present in goblin political thinking throughout the relevant period. The physical communities that goblins maintained outside the Gringotts context, the residential areas, the craft workshops, the social structures that operated independently of the bank, are almost entirely invisible in the Harry Potter narrative, because Harry never enters them, and no one who does enter them appears as a viewpoint character. The glimpses available come through background details, references to goblin markets operating in areas separate from Diagon Alley, mentions of goblin families, the existence of goblin cultural practices that extend beyond their professional roles at the bank. The books hint at a full culture without depicting it, which is consistent with the narrative's broader approach to non-human magical beings, who are rendered in terms of their interactions with the human protagonists rather than as fully realized communities with their own interior lives. The question of what goblins wanted, as distinct from what goblins demanded in political negotiations, is one the books do not answer, and probably cannot answer, given the narrative constraints. What we can say is that the pattern of goblin political behavior across 5 centuries reveals consistent priorities: recognition of legal standing, access to the primary instruments of magical practice, protection of their property traditions, and genuine rather than nominal participation in the governance of the world they lived in and, through the bank, substantially funded. Whether those priorities would have been satisfied by any arrangement short of a fundamental restructuring of the power relationship between goblins and wizard governance is a question the books do not explore, because no such arrangement was ever offered. Chapter 2: The Founding of Gringotts. The goblin whose name the bank carries is known in wizarding records simply as Gringott. The name, as it appears in wizard documentation, is almost certainly a simplified transliteration of a gobbledygook name that does not map cleanly onto the phonetic conventions of written English. What the surviving records agree on is that he was the central organizing intelligence behind the creation of the institution sometime in the 1400s, during a period when the British Isles were navigating political upheaval that affected both the Muggle and wizarding worlds in parallel, though for different reasons and through different mechanisms. The founding of Gringotts was not an act of goblin generosity toward wizard society. It was not a gesture of cooperation inspired by mutual goodwill or a shared vision of a better wizarding world. It was a calculated decision made under specific and deteriorating political circumstances by goblins who understood their own situation with considerable clarity and were looking for a form of institutional leverage that would outlast whatever governance arrangement wizard society settled into next. To understand the decision requires understanding the circumstances that produced it. Goblin communities in Britain in the early 1400s were facing a slow compression that had been building for generations. As wizarding settlements grew larger, more organized, and more self-consciously distinct from both Muggle communities and non-human magical communities, the land that had been shared, contested, and negotiated across for centuries began to be claimed in increasingly formal terms. Wizard families established hereditary estates. The proto-ministry structures of the Wizards' Council began passing laws that defined territory and resources in ways that reflected wizard interests and wizard legal traditions. Goblin communities that had occupied certain areas for generations found themselves categorized as occupants rather than owners, their historical presence acknowledged but not treated as conferring any legally recognized claim. At the same time, goblin metalworking and financial sophistication were qualities that wizard society valued intensely and could not replicate. The demand for goblin-made objects was high. The demand for reliable storage of accumulated wealth, which the volatile and often dangerous wizard political environment of the period made urgent, was also high. Wizard families with significant gold holdings were storing them in chests in manor houses, in cellars, in holes dug in gardens. in methods that required constant physical security in an era when castle walls and locked doors were the primary tools available. Summoning charms, unlocking spells, and the various other techniques that were already part of the wizard's magical toolkit made ordinary physical security inadequate. What was needed was something that combined magical security with institutional continuity, a place where wealth could be stored and protected by people with both the magical capabilities and the professional commitment to do it reliably. Goblins had been developing the infrastructure for this kind of institution for decades before the formal founding. The vault systems that would eventually spiral down beneath Diagon Alley existed in simpler form in goblin communities, where the same need for secure storage of valuable materials and craft supplies had produced similar solutions. The enchantment principles were goblin enchantment principles. The record-keeping systems were adapted from goblin trade documentation practices. The security thinking, the core idea that the goal was not merely to keep things in but to make unauthorized removal of things practically impossible, was already embedded in goblin institutional design before any wizard brought gold to a goblin counter. What Gringotts and his associates were offering the wizard community in the 1400s was in effect a complete financial institution ready to operate. Bring your gold, we will keep it safer than you can manage. We will maintain records of what you own, and we will charge a reasonable fee for these services. The offer was compelling in a period when no comparable wizard institution existed, and the accumulated wealth of several generations of wizarding families was sitting in improvised storage of varying quality. But the offer came with conditions, and those conditions are where the real significance of the arrangement lies. The first condition, Gringotts would operate independently. Wizard government would not supervise the bank's internal operations, would not have access to vault records without goblin management's consent, and would not have the authority to appoint, dismiss, or direct goblin staff. The bank would answer to goblin governance, not to whatever wizard, ministry, or council happened to be in power at any given moment. This condition, which sounds like a reasonable protection for institutional integrity in the context of a new commercial venture, has in practice meant that no wizard government in the 5+ centuries since the founding has ever had direct access to the bank's internal records. Every governmental attempt to audit Gringotts, to investigate accounts as part of criminal proceedings, to verify claims about vault contents, has required goblin cooperation and has been subject to goblin interpretation of what information was appropriate to share and in what form. The second condition, Gringotts would maintain political neutrality in wizard conflicts. The bank would serve any client with legitimate wealth regardless of their political affiliations, their crimes, their standing with the ministry, or which side of any given conflict they supported. This neutrality was presented as a commercial necessity. A bank that took sides in wizard political disputes would become a target for whichever side it opposed, which would threaten both the institution's continuity and the safety of assets in its care. The argument was pragmatically sound. The effect was that across 500 years of wizard political history, including 2 wars involving the darkest wizard of any era, Gringotts has never frozen an account, never refused service to a client based on political affiliation, and never shared account information with any party investigating wizard criminals without specific authorization from goblin management. The third condition, the currency of the wizarding world, the galleon, sickle, and newt system, would be managed by Gringotts. Wizard government would have input into broad monetary policy questions, but the actual decisions about currency production, coin composition, and exchange rates would be goblin decisions made by goblin management. This is monetary sovereignty in the most direct sense, and it was established as a goblin prerogative in the founding agreement, and has never been substantively revised. These 3 conditions taken together describe something that looks very different from the surface description of Gringotts as a bank that serves the wizarding public. They describe an institution with independent governance, currency control, financial intelligence on every significant wizarding family in Britain, and a policy of serving all parties in any conflict. This is not a service provider in any conventional sense. It is an independent power, operating within the wizarding world on its own terms, with leverage over every other institution that depends on money to function, which is every institution without exception. The wizard negotiators who agreed to these terms in the 1400s were solving an immediate problem. Goblin communities had been in various states of armed tension with wizard settlements for decades, and a stable arrangement that gave goblins a defined and financially productive role within the broader wizard economy was preferable to continued conflict. The longer-term consequences of the arrangement, the 5-century accumulation of goblin financial leverage, were real but not visible in the way that an immediate goblin raid on a wizard estate was visible. Long-term consequences rarely compete effectively with immediate relief in any negotiation. The building itself was designed to communicate what the institution was. White marble, specifically and expensively imported, chosen over the local stone that would have been far cheaper and far more consistent with the surrounding architecture of what would become Diagon Alley. The marble says, without requiring any explanation, that the institution behind it has resources and intends to remain. The scale of the structure, the way the interior dwarfs the impression given by the facade, is deliberate. Gringotts is not trying to fit into its neighborhood. It is anchoring the neighborhood around itself, establishing a physical presence that will be recognized as permanent, long after the buildings around it have changed several times over. The warning poem between the bronze and silver doors was carved into the stone at the founding and has not been changed in 5 centuries. Its function is more complex than it appears. The surface reading is a warning to thieves, which it certainly is. The deeper reading is a statement about what the institution understands ownership to mean. The poem distinguishes between treasure and what is earned, between what a visitor seeks and what legitimately belongs to them. These distinctions, as we will see at length, are precisely the distinctions that sit at the heart of the most persistent conflict between goblins and wizards. The choice to carve those specific principles into the entrance of the bank at its founding was not decorative. It was a statement of values that goblins intended to maintain, regardless of whether wizard clients or wizard government ever chose to acknowledge those values as legitimate. Inside, the hall operates with the smooth efficiency of an institution that has been running the same core functions for several centuries and has refined every procedure until it has no unnecessary components. The tellers behind the counters are precise, fast, and professionally disengaged from the social patterns of the clients they serve. They are not cold, they are focused. The work they are doing, the actual counting, weighing, sorting, and recording of the transactions that keep the wizarding economy moving, is more demanding than it appears, and the ledgers open in front of them contain information in gobbledygook that represents the financial life of the entire wizarding world in organized, cross-referenced, protected form. The goblins behind those counters have access to more information about wizard wealth than the Ministry of Magic does. They always have. The early decades of the bank's operation established patterns that persisted for centuries. The vault system expanded as the client base grew. The currency management function was formalized as the galleon became more widely accepted across wizarding Britain and, eventually, internationally. International connections developed as Gringotts established relationships with wizarding banking institutions in France and Germany, and, somewhat later, with banking traditions in wizarding communities further abroad. The galleon became, not by formal decree, but by the practical gravity of Gringotts' reach and reputation, the closest thing the international wizarding community had to a common reserve currency. This meant that the goblin standard for what a galleon was worth carried economic weight in wizarding transactions from Britain to Eastern Europe to North Africa. By the time the Ministry of Magic was formally established in 1707, replacing the haphazard Wizards' Council with a more structured governmental apparatus, Gringotts was already 2.5 centuries old and operating with the institutional confidence of an entity that had outlasted several previous governance arrangements and expected to outlast this one too. The ministry's founders, whatever their ambitions about organizing wizarding society under a coherent governmental structure, found themselves at the outset of that project, negotiating with an institution that had more continuous historical existence than they did, and that was not inclined to revise the terms of its founding agreement to accommodate the organizational preferences of a new government. The specific political calendar that surrounded the founding is worth considering in more detail. The 1400s in wizarding Britain were a period when the administrative structures that wizard communities had been improvising for centuries were beginning to crystallize into something more formalized. The Wizards' Council, while still the primary governing body, was under pressure from the same forces that were producing the Statute of Secrecy negotiations internationally. A wizarding world that was becoming too populous and too active to manage through the informal systems that had sufficed when communities were smaller and more isolated. The need for formal institutions was becoming apparent to wizard governance at the same moment that goblins were developing the infrastructure to offer one. The timing was not accidental from the goblin side. Goblin leadership in this period was tracking the consolidation of wizard political structures carefully, and the founding of Gringotts was timed partly in response to the opportunity that the wizard need for formal institutions created. An offer made before wizard governance was ready to formalize would not have received the same reception. An offer made after wizard governance had already developed its own financial infrastructure would have had far less leverage. The window, in the mid-1400s, when wizard communities clearly needed a banking institution and had not yet produced one, was the window that goblin leadership moved through. And the terms of the founding agreement reflect the clarity of that strategic timing. The negotiations themselves were conducted over a period of months, possibly longer, and involved goblin representatives who were sophisticated in both financial matters and political negotiation. The wizard negotiators were, by most assessments, primarily motivated by the desire to solve the immediate problem of wealth storage and currency management, and were less attentive to the longer-term implications of the terms they were agreeing to. This asymmetry of attention, goblins thinking about the institutional terrain ahead and wizards focused on the immediate operational benefit, is visible in the founding agreement's terms. The conditions that goblins insisted on make much more sense as the product of long-term strategic thinking than as ordinary commercial negotiation. The internal Goblin debate about whether to establish the bank was not recorded in any source accessible to outside parties, but it certainly occurred. Offering financial services to wizard society was a significant commitment. It required Goblin institutions to be involved with wizard wealth on an ongoing basis, to be physically present in wizard commercial areas, to hire staff who would spend their working lives in close proximity to wizard clients. For communities that had maintained significant independence from wizard governance structures, this was a cultural as well as an economic decision. The faction within Goblin politics that supported the bank appears to have prevailed because the bank offered something that the alternative of continued independence did not: a position of structural influence over wizard society that could not be easily revoked once established. The first years of the bank's operation required trust building from both sides. Wizard families depositing their gold in Goblin-run vaults for the first time were taking a calculated risk. The Goblin reputation for reliability in financial matters was established through other dealings. But a vault holding the savings of multiple generations was a different order of commitment than previous transactions had involved. Goblins, for their part, were taking on custodial responsibility for wizard wealth in conditions where any loss or breach would damage the institution's reputation at the precise moment when that reputation was being established. The early operation was careful and deliberate, and the absence of any significant failure in that early period established the credibility that the bank built its subsequent expansion on. The expansion of the banking function into international operations came over the following century, as Gringotts' reputation grew and wizarding communities in France, Germany, and the Low Countries began to see the advantage of transactional relationships with a stable institution rather than the improvised bilateral arrangements they had been using. The Goblin approach to these international negotiations replicated the approach taken in Britain. The bank would provide genuine financial services in exchange for operational independence, currency management authority in the relevant international exchange function, and the maintenance of neutrality in the political conflicts of the region served. Whether foreign wizarding governments found these terms as favorable as the original British negotiators is not clear, but the terms were accepted, and Gringotts' international network grew steadily across the 15 and 1600s. Chapter 3. The Underground World. Most wizards who visit Gringotts never see anything below the main hall. They change money at the counter, perhaps take the cart to a vault, collect or deposit what they came for, and leave. The journey to a vault, particularly a standard family vault, passes through enough of the underground system to give an impression of scale. The cart, the tracks, the cold air, the torchlight passing overhead in streaks as the cart accelerates. What it does not give is an accurate sense of the geography, because the underground system of Gringotts is designed specifically to resist accurate mental mapping. The disorientation is intentional and sophisticated, built into the tunnel routing, the speed of the cart, and the spatial enchantments that alter the traveler's sense of direction and distance without them being aware of it happening. The depth of the vault system has no parallel in any other structure in the wizarding world, and very few in the Muggle world. The deepest vaults are not a few stories underground in the way a Muggle bank's secure storage might be. They are miles below the surface. The tunnel system descends in a combination of actual physical depth and magically compressed spatial distance, which means that the journey from the main hall to the deepest vault levels takes longer in subjective experience than the actual physical distance covered would suggest. Goblins have been extending the lower levels for centuries, and the deepest chambers in the current system were carved and enchanted generations ago by goblins who have been dead for a very long time, whose specific methods are preserved in gobbledygook documentation maintained by current management. Temperature changes as you descend. The upper levels, nearest the main hall, are cool in the way stone basements are cool, a few degrees below the ambient temperature of London regardless of the season. Moving deeper, the air becomes progressively colder and drier. The humidity changes too, in ways that are relevant to the magical properties of objects stored at different depths. Certain enchantments hold better in dry, cold environments. Certain types of dark objects are more stable when kept in conditions that retard the natural decay of magical charge over time. The environmental design of the deeper vault levels reflects a sophisticated understanding of how different magical objects interact with their storage environment, built up over centuries of Goblin practical experience. The cart system, which connects the main hall to the vault levels through a network of tracks that runs throughout the underground, is a piece of Goblin engineering that has no wizard equivalent. The tracks are embedded in the tunnel floors and walls and, in some sections, the ceilings, following routes that change direction in 3 dimensions rather than just 2. The carts run without any mechanical propulsion system visible to a passenger. They respond to Goblin guidance. A Goblin employee can direct a cart by touch, and the cart adjusts speed and direction accordingly. Non-Goblin passengers on the carts experience a smooth, extremely fast ride that gives them very little ability to understand the route they are traveling or to retrace it without Goblin assistance. The tracks have been modified and extended multiple times over the centuries as the vault system expanded. Some sections of track in the upper levels are original construction from the bank's founding period and are maintained by reinforcing their original enchantments rather than replacing them. partly because the original Goblin metalwork is still structurally sound, and partly because no one is entirely certain what the consequences of removing 500-year-old track enchantments would be in terms of the complete structural integrity of the tunnels around them. Certain tunnels, particularly in the deeper sections, have been reinforced with layers of Goblin enchantment over generations, until the stone of the walls has been altered to the point where it has properties that ordinary stone does not possess. It is harder. It responds differently to magical detection spells, and it appears to have some capacity for detecting unauthorized magical activity in its vicinity that is not fully understood even by current Goblin management. The Thief's Downfall, located at a critical junction in the tunnel system that separates the upper standard security levels from the lower high security areas, is the most architecturally distinctive security feature in Gringotts. It is a waterfall, running from ceiling to floor across the full width of the tunnel, producing a constant roaring sound that fills the tunnel for some distance in both directions. Passing through it, which every cart and passenger must do when traveling to the high security vault levels, has no physical effect beyond getting wet. The magical effect is total. Every enchantment, potion, illusion, concealment charm, glamour, transfiguration, or other magical modification currently active on anyone or anything passing through it is immediately neutralized. The magic that creates the downfall's effect is woven into the water itself by a continuous Goblin enchantment process that has been maintained in unbroken succession since the waterfall was installed. The design logic of the Thief's Downfall illustrates a fundamental difference between Goblin and Wizard security thinking. Wizard security tends to work by creating barriers, by putting things between a potential intruder and what they want. Locked doors, detection spells, guard creatures, all of these are barriers. Goblin security, at its most sophisticated, works by reversal. Instead of stopping someone from getting somewhere, it removes the tools they brought with them to get there. The Thief's Downfall does not stop someone from passing through it. It stops them from being anything other than exactly what they are when they pass through. A disguised thief becomes an undisguised thief. An imperious guard becomes a guard acting under their own judgment again. An enchanted object loses whatever enchantment has been placed on it by an outside party. The waterfall is both more elegant and more thorough than a barrier would be, because barriers can be circumvented and reversal cannot. Beyond the Thief's Downfall, the architecture of the high security levels changes materially. The tunnels narrow slightly, the ceiling drops. The stone of the walls, already enchanted by Goblin reinforcement, carries heavier layers of detection and deterrence magic that a sensitive wizard can feel as a change in atmosphere without being able to identify its specific components. The lighting, which in the upper levels comes from torches maintained by Goblin staff, in the lower levels transitions to a faint luminescence in the stone itself, a property that appears to be another product of the Goblin enchantment tradition rather than any wizard-produced light source. The effect is a pale, even illumination that casts no shadows, which means there are no dark corners in the high-security tunnel areas and nowhere for a person or object to be less visible than anywhere else. The dragon. By the time Harry, Ron, and Hermione made their approach to the Lestrange Vault in 1997, the dragon occupying one of the lower tunnel sections had been there for a long time. Long enough that no Goblin employee currently working at Gringotts had started the job before the dragon arrived. Long enough that the specific Goblin management decision that placed it there had been made by a previous generation of management and had been inherited as a given feature of the security landscape rather than a deliberate ongoing choice. The dragon was a Ukrainian ironbelly, one of the larger species, with plated skin resistant to most ordinary spells and a wingspan that made the tunnel sections nearest its habitual position very difficult to navigate if the creature was not actively contained. The control method was behavioral conditioning implemented through pain association. The specific clanging sounds that Goblins used to direct the dragon had been, over the course of its captivity, consistently paired with physical pain from the spiked instruments used to manage it. The dragon had learned, with the thoroughness of a creature with no reason to learn otherwise, that clanging sounds meant incoming pain. The clanging sounds therefore produced retreat behavior rather than forward movement. This was effective, reliable security under normal conditions. It was a security system with a specific vulnerability. Any intruder who knew about the conditioning and could produce the relevant sounds could direct the dragon's movement without the clanging actually being accompanied by any pain mechanism. The dragon's behavior was a product of its training, not its intelligence. And training-based systems respond to the trained stimulus regardless of whether the system it was embedded in intended that specific application. The dragon's condition during this period was not good. Kept underground, away from natural light and fresh air, in a space too small for comfortable movement, trained through repeated pain application, and fed enough to maintain function without thriving. The creature that burst through the ceiling of Gringotts into Diagon Alley daylight in 1997 had never, in its recent memory, if dragons have memory in any meaningful sense, experienced open sky. Its immediate response to suddenly being in open air after years underground was to go as far from everything familiar as it could, which meant flying away from the city and over open country until its physical condition weakened by captivity, forced it to land at a lake. That it managed to carry 3 people on its back while doing so says something about the residual physical capability of even a compromised ironbelly. The sealed sections of the lower levels, areas that are not actively used and not included in any map accessible to non-goblin parties, represent an aspect of Gringotts' underground geography that receives no attention in the main Harry Potter narrative. Institutions that have been operating for 5 centuries accumulate spaces they no longer fully understand. Tunnels, carved for purposes that were abandoned or whose original function was completed centuries ago. Vaults whose contents were removed and whose accounts were closed but whose physical structures were never repurposed. Chambers built for specific magical operations that are no longer practiced. The sealed sections are maintained by Gringotts in the sense that their structural enchantments are monitored and kept from failing, but their specific contents, if any remain, are a matter of institutional memory that may not be fully accessible even to current senior management. The deeper you go in the Gringotts tunnel system, the further you get from what any wizard has ever seen, and the further you get from what even current goblin staff could describe with complete confidence. The maintenance operations required to keep the underground system functioning are substantial and largely invisible to clients. Every enchantment in the tunnel system requires periodic reinforcement because even goblin enchantments, embedded in stone rather than applied to its surface, experience a slow natural decay over very long time periods. The maintenance cycle for different sections of the tunnel varies according to the age and type of enchantment involved. Newer tunnel sections require maintenance on relatively short cycles because the enchantments have not yet settled into the kind of stable long-term equilibrium that very old goblin enchantments develop. The original tunnel sections from the 1400s require maintenance too, but the nature of that maintenance is different. Not reinforcing fading enchantments, but monitoring stable ones for any signs of structural stress in the surrounding stone that might affect their integrity. The goblin staff who perform this maintenance work are not the tellers who work in the main hall. Enchantment maintenance at Gringotts is a separate specialization, requiring the specific combination of goblin magical practice and detailed knowledge of the bank's underground system that only long-serving members of that particular goblin workforce would have. They work in the tunnels during hours when the bank is closed to clients, which in the case of the deepest sections means hours that do not overlap with any client operations at all. Since the deepest vaults are not accessed frequently and the work can be scheduled without disruption to normal banking functions, the quality of the underground air, while notably cold and dry in the high-security sections, is actively managed in ways that are not immediately apparent to a visitor. Goblins who work underground for extended periods require air quality that supports their physical functioning. The tunnel ventilation system is a feat of engineering that uses both physical channels cut through the surrounding stone and magically maintained air movement to circulate oxygen through tunnel sections that would otherwise accumulate. Atmospheric problems over time. The specific locations of the ventilation channels are not documented in any source accessible to outside parties. The existence of the ventilation system is apparent from the fact that the air in the tunnels is breathable, which, at the depths involved and without obvious natural openings to the surface, requires active management. The relationship between the tunnel system and the groundwater of London is a practical engineering challenge that the construction of the original tunnel sections addressed through goblin enchantment and that subsequent extensions have had to address repeatedly as the tunnels went deeper and encountered underground water in various forms. The rock under London includes strata that carry significant groundwater, and at certain depths the tunnels pass through or alongside water-bearing rock formations. The waterproofing enchantments that keep the tunnel walls dry are some of the oldest continuous enchantments in the bank, because failure in those enchantments in the deepest sections would affect not just the tunnel but the vault chambers connected to it. The thief's downfall uses water deliberately as a security mechanism. The rest of the tunnel system keeps water out deliberately as an operational necessity. The lighting in the standard tunnel sections, maintained by torch-carrying goblin staff, follows a schedule that roughly parallels the bank's client-facing hours. As the bank closes at the end of a working day, the torch maintenance schedule shifts to a lower frequency pattern. Tunnels that will not be traveled until the following morning have their torches banked rather than extinguished, maintained at a lower output that can be brought back to full brightness quickly when needed. This is a practical efficiency that also functions as a passive security signal. A fully lit tunnel section in a period when it should be dim means someone is present in that section who should not be. The tunnel lighting is, in this sense, a passive monitoring system as well as a practical amenity. The carts themselves require maintenance that is distinct from the track maintenance. The cart bodies are made from goblin-worked metal that shares some properties with the broader goblin metallurgical tradition. They are durable beyond what ordinary metalwork would achieve. They show minimal wear, despite the considerable physical stresses of high-speed travel on tracks that twist in multiple dimensions. And their enchantments, governing response to goblin guidance, are embedded in the material of the cart body rather than in any separable mechanism. The maintenance of cart enchantments is part of the same specialized function as tunnel enchantment maintenance, performed by the same category of goblin staff during the same off-hours periods. The physical materials used in the tunnel construction, beyond the stone of the surrounding London geology, include goblin-worked metal in various structural and functional roles. The door frames for vault chambers are metal, worked in the goblin tradition and carrying the same embedded enchantment properties that characterize goblin metalwork in other contexts. The track fixtures that guide the cart system through the more complex three-dimensional sections of the route are goblin-worked metal. The specific material properties of these fixtures, the way they hold enchantment over time without degrading, the way they resist the physical stresses of high-speed cart travel across centuries of continuous use, are properties of how they were made rather than of any maintenance regime. The maintenance of goblin-made metal components in the tunnel system is largely a matter of checking that they remain physically intact, because the magical properties do not require the kind of periodic refreshing that wizard-applied enchantments would. Chapter 4. The Vault System. The vault numbering system at Gringotts runs from single digits for the oldest accounts into the thousands for recently opened ones. And this numbering tells you things about the institution's history that no official publication has ever laid out explicitly. Low numbers mean greater age and, in most cases, greater depth. They also tend to mean greater security complexity, not because all low-numbered vaults hold more valuable items, but because the security philosophy applied to the earliest vaults was the most elaborate and the most thoroughly tested over time. The vaults whose numbers run into the single digits belong to accounts established at or near the bank's founding, and their current status, whether they contain anything, who the account holders are or were, what the security specifications look like after 5 centuries of maintenance and enhancement, is information that Gringotts treats as the most internal of its internal matters. The standard family vault, the kind that the Weasley family uses, operates on relatively simple principles. The vault has a metal door designed to respond to a goblin key. A goblin employee with the key opens the door, the account holder enters or sends a representative, items are deposited or withdrawn, the door is closed and locked. The security here relies entirely on the outer perimeter. The assumption is that the difficulty of reaching the vault through the tunnel system is itself sufficient protection for a vault holding a modest quantity of coin. There are no curses on the interior of a standard vault, no detection enchantments on the items inside, no additional mechanisms beyond the door and the key. The Weasley Vault, seen briefly in the first book, is a small stone chamber with a small pile of coins, and the security protecting those coins consists of the entire distance and complexity between them and the main hall. As vault classification rises, the security design changes in kind rather than just in degree. The assumption that applies to standard vaults, that the outer perimeter is sufficient, does not apply to high-security vaults. The working assumption for high-security vault security is that a sufficiently determined and knowledgeable person might conceivably reach the vault door. The vault itself must therefore be capable of defeating them. The methods used to make a vault its own defense are the products of goblin enchantment tradition applied to the specific problem of unauthorized access, and they demonstrate a systematic approach to failure mode analysis that is impressive even in the abstract. The Geminio curse and the Flagrante curse work as a system rather than as independent enchantments. Either curse alone has limited defensive value against a determined thief. The Geminio curse, which creates an immediate duplicate of any touched object, would by itself be merely annoying. Someone who knew about it could simply look rather than touch. The Flagrante curse, which makes any touched or duplicated object extremely hot, would by itself be an obstacle, but not an insurmountable one for someone with adequate protective spells. Together, however, they create a self-compounding problem. The heat of a flagranted object causes a person to drop it involuntarily, and that dropped object lands on other objects in the vault, touching them and triggering the Geminio on those objects, which immediately become flagranted as well. The new duplicates, which are indistinguishable from originals to a viewer who does not know which was which to begin with, also become hot and are dropped. Within a few minutes of a single unauthorized touch, a vault can be filling with thousands of burning copies of every object it contains. The heat becomes dangerous to any unprotected person, and the originals are lost in an avalanche of identical copies that cannot be safely sorted. The practical problem this creates for a thief who knows what they are looking for is that time becomes the enemy. Harry's group needed a specific object from the Lestrange vault, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. In a vault, crowded with dark artifacts, treasures, and accumulated family possessions, identifying the cup required visual search, which required not touching anything while searching. Given the layout of the vault, which was packed to a degree that made movement without incidental contact almost impossible, avoiding all contact while locating a specific small cup was not realistic. The burns that Harry, Ron, and Hermione sustained during the search were the predictable result of a space that the security system had designed to be increasingly hostile to unauthorized presence over time. Vault 713, where the Philosopher's Stone was held briefly before Dumbledore removed it, is an interesting case in the Gringotts security taxonomy. It is not numbered among the lowest single-digit vaults that would indicate maximum institutional security. It is a mid-range vault number, which would suggest a relatively standard access level. The security on it, however, was specifically upgraded for the stone's presence with an additional enchantment involving a mirror that Dumbledore arranged. This creates an interesting picture of how bespoke security works at Gringotts. The institutional security of the vault is the baseline, and additional specific enchantments can be layered on top by authorized parties, including, in appropriate circumstances, outside parties with special permission from Goblin management. The stone's presence was not widely advertised within the bank, which is itself a security measure. If a high-security deposit is housed in a mid-range vault number, anyone tracking unusual security arrangements by vault classification will not identify the location from the numbering alone. The Goblin key system is the primary access control mechanism for most vaults. Each vault has a corresponding key, and in the standard model, presentation of the key to a Goblin teller authorizes access to that vault for that visit. The loss of a key is a significant event requiring a visit to Gringotts in person to prove identity and account ownership through a verification process that Goblin staff conduct through methods not fully described in the available records. For high-security vaults, the verification process for a lost key is presumably more demanding than for a standard vault, involving additional documentation and potentially a waiting period designed to prevent someone who has stolen a key and is trying to claim it was lost from using the verification process to gain legitimate access. Inherited vault access. The situation that arises when an account holder dies and their vault passes to another person is handled according to Goblin institutional law rather than Ministry of Magic succession law. Gringotts maintains documentation of account succession arrangements filed by account holders at any point in the vault's history. When succession occurs, it is processed according to that documentation. If the documentation specifies that the vault passes to a specific person, that person receives access regardless of what wizard courts or ministry officials might separately rule about the estate. This independence from wizard legal authority over succession has occasionally produced friction between Gringotts and wizard families disputing inheritance, but the bank's position has been consistent. Its legal obligations are to the arrangements recorded in its own documentation, and wizard court rulings do not override those arrangements. The vault that Sirius Black held, numbered 711, transferred to Harry Potter following Sirius's death based on documentation Sirius had filed making Harry his heir. This transfer happened without ministry involvement or wizard legal proceedings. Harry arrived at Gringotts with the relevant documentation and was confirmed as the vault holder on the basis of Goblin internal process. The implications of this, for the more general question of what Gringotts recognizes as legally authoritative, are significant. In the most literal sense, Goblin recognition of ownership is what makes ownership real within the wizarding financial system, because Goblin recognition is what determines who has access to what. The question of what happens to vault assets when there are no surviving documented heirs is not addressed in any wizard-accessible source. The long-term history of the bank suggests that this situation has arisen multiple times across 5 centuries, given the attrition of ancient families through war, magical accidents, and other causes. Goblin institutional practice in these cases is presumably governed by internal law documented in gobbledygook, which means it has never been subject to scrutiny by outside parties. The reasonable inference, given what we understand about Goblin concepts of property and ownership, is that assets in unclaimed vaults do not simply sit indefinitely. At some point in the institutional process, goods that have no recognized human claimant are likely reclassified under Goblin custodial principles. What that means in practice, whether it constitutes what wizard law would call appropriation, or whether Goblin law treats it as a form of legitimate reversion, is one of the many questions about Gringotts' internal workings that remain outside public knowledge. The experience of visiting a high-security vault as an authorized account holder is, according to the limited accounts available, noticeably different from visiting a standard vault. The journey is longer. The tunnel sections nearest the high-security areas have a perceptibly different atmosphere, a combination of the environmental change at greater depth and the density of enchantments in the surrounding stone. The vault doors are larger, more elaborately worked, and visually distinct from standard vault doors in ways that reflect their additional enchantment layers. The flagrante enchantment on the items inside is dormant for authorized visitors. The curse distinguishes between authorized and unauthorized contact, though the mechanism by which a curse on an object determines authorization status is itself a product of Goblin enchantment that has no straightforward explanation in terms of standard wizard magical theory. The history of specific vaults and what they have held across the centuries of the bank's operation is largely inaccessible because vault records are maintained in gobbledygook and Goblin management has never produced a public accounting of vault contents or vault histories. What enters the available record is what has been publicly discussed in the context of specific events: the stone, the Horcrux, the various dark artifacts that the Lestrange vault is described as containing. These items are not typical of what high-security vaults hold. The more common contents of high-security ancient family vaults are exactly what you would expect from very old and wealthy wizarding families: accumulated gold, heirloom objects with strong enchantments, legal documents in protective containers, potentially dangerous magical items collected by adventurous ancestors and stored safely because no one was quite sure what to do with them, and the kind of miscellaneous valuable accumulation that results from a family maintaining a vault without regularly clearing it out for several generations. The question of dark artifacts in Gringotts storage deserves attention because it represents a clear area where Goblin institutional neutrality and wizard law come into contact without fully aligning. Wizard law prohibits the ownership of certain categories of dark artifact. The Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement has the authority to confiscate prohibited items from the possession of wizard owners. The Lestrange vault clearly contained items that fell into this category, and their presence in the vault had been known to ministry officials for years. The reason the vault contents were not seized is that seizing them required Goblin cooperation, and Goblin cooperation required authorization processes and procedures that went through Gringotts management rather than happening at ministry direction. The Ministry of Magic cannot simply send auras into Gringotts to conduct a vault search. It must request Goblin authorization, provide legal documentation, go through a formal process, and accept whatever form Goblin management decides is appropriate for its institutional involvement. In the case of the Lestrange Vault, this process apparently never produced the outcome of a ministry seizure of the contents, either because the process was never completed or because Goblin management did not consider the ministry's documentation adequate under Goblin institutional standards. The Vault security philosophy has an interesting relationship with transparency. On one level, Gringotts is completely transparent about the existence of its security systems. The warning poem advertises the consequences of theft. The thief's downfall is known to exist. The general fact that vaults have curses on them is common knowledge. On another level, the specific details of how the security works, which particular curses are deployed in which vaults, at what point the detection systems activate, what triggers the alert to the surface, are maintained in strict confidence. This is standard security practice. Advertise that security exists. Keep the mechanisms proprietary. What makes Gringotts unusual is that the security mechanisms are sufficiently sophisticated and sufficiently different from ordinary wizard enchantment practice that even general knowledge of their existence provides limited information to. A potential intruder, knowing the thief's downfall exists, tells you to expect a waterfall in the tunnel. It does not tell you exactly where it is, how wide the enchantment extends, whether there are backup mechanisms that activate after it passes, or what specific categories of enchantment it removes beyond the obvious ones. The vault access system has evolved over the bank's history in response to specific incidents and to the changing nature of the threat environment. Early vaults used simpler access control mechanisms that were appropriate for the security environment of the 1500s. As wizard capabilities for deception and magical concealment improved, the vault access systems improved in parallel. The polyjuice potion problem, which the 1997 break-in exploited, had presumably been considered as a threat scenario before, though the specific combination of polyjuice, insider knowledge, and imperious curse used in that break-in was apparently more sophisticated than previous risk models had anticipated. The security review that followed the break-in would have included updated threat modeling that incorporated the specific combination of techniques demonstrated. The vault system also serves functions beyond simple storage that are less visible in the books, but presumably significant in practice. Legal documentation storage is one. Wills, contracts, certificates, and other important legal papers are commonly kept in vault conditions that protect them from fire, water, magical damage, and unauthorized access. The existence of a valid document in a Gringotts vault is itself a form of authentication, because accessing the vault to retrieve or examine the document requires the authorization process that Goblin management applies to all vault access. Whether Goblin management has ever been asked to testify in wizard legal proceedings about what documentation was in a particular vault on a particular date, and whether they would cooperate with such a request, is the kind of question that the independence of Goblin institutional operations from wizard legal processes leaves perpetually open. The emotional dimension of vault visits for wizard clients is something the books touch briefly in the first book, when Harry sees his inheritance for the first time, and the experience is written as a moment of wonder and grounding. For many wizarding families, the vault represents accumulated family history in a very literal sense, objects that belong to parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, documentation of family decisions across generations, material evidence of where the family came from and what it has been through. Goblins who manage these accounts across generations develop, presumably, an institutional knowledge of family financial histories that is more detailed and more continuous than any other single source. The perspective of a Gringotts Goblin teller on the financial and material histories of the families they serve would be extraordinary. 500 years of client relationships produces a depth of institutional knowledge that no other organization in the wizarding world possesses. Chapter 5. The Goblin Economy. The three-coin system that most wizards grow up treating as simply the way money works has, behind it, An entire monetary infrastructure that operates entirely under Goblin control and has done so for the entire history of the post-medieval wizarding world. Galleons are gold, sickles are silver, knuts are bronze. The exchange rates between them, 17 sickles to a galleon and 29 nuts to a sickle, are numbers that wizarding children learn and wizarding adults never question. In the same way that most people never question the denomination structure of their national currency, the questions of where these numbers came from, who decided them, whether they have always been exactly that, and who has the authority to change them, are questions that the vast majority of wizarding people have never had reason to ask. A galleon is not simply a gold coin of a particular weight and size. Its composition is a matter of Goblin metallurgical specification that has been maintained continuously since the founding of the bank. The proportion of metals in the alloy, the precise weight, the size, the surface design, and crucially, the specific magical properties embedded in the metal during the minting process, are all governed by Goblin standards. The anti-counterfeiting properties of a genuine galleon are not wizard-produced security enchantments added after minting. They are properties of the material itself, produced during the Goblin minting process through methods that are not documented anywhere in any language accessible to non-Goblins. A galleon produced by a wizard attempting counterfeiting can be made to look like a galleon and weigh like a galleon, but it lacks the specific magical signature that Goblin-produced galleons carry, and this signature can be detected by anyone with the relevant knowledge, which means by Goblins. Galleon counterfeiting is treated as one of the most serious financial crimes in wizard law, prosecuted more severely than many other fraud offenses. The official explanation is that currency counterfeiting destabilizes the economy. The more specific explanation is that successful galleon counterfeiting at scale would undermine the credibility of Gringotts currency production, which is the foundation of the monetary system. The severity of the prosecution is proportional to the institutional threat, not merely to the personal financial harm caused to individual victims of fraud. The international operations of Gringotts represent a dimension of Goblin economic reach that the main Harry Potter narrative barely touches. Britain's wizarding economy does not exist in isolation. There are wizarding communities across Europe and beyond Europe, each with their own currency traditions, their own banking institutions, and their own relationships with Gringotts. The bank's international exchange function, converting galleons to French magical currency or German wizarding money for travelers and international traders, has been a core service since the early centuries of the institution. The rates at which these exchanges happen are negotiated between Gringotts and foreign institutions in a diplomatic process conducted in gobbledygook or through Goblin translators. The Ministry of Magic's role in these negotiations is limited to the extent that Goblins find it useful to include wizard government, which is to say, limited indeed. The galleon's status as an international reserve currency among wizarding financial institutions is a product of Gringotts' reputation and reach, rather than any formal treaty or agreement. In the absence of a unified wizarding international monetary authority, different wizarding communities have developed their own currencies and their own exchange arrangements. The galleon has achieved the widest acceptance, partly because Gringotts' international network is the most extensive, partly because Gringotts' institutional continuity is the longest, and partly because the galleon's anti-counterfeiting properties make it the most trusted large-denomination magical currency in international transactions. Goblins set the exchange rate for galleons against foreign currencies through the negotiating position of Gringotts in bilateral currency arrangements, which means Goblin monetary decisions have economic effects that extend to wizarding communities far beyond Britain. The neutrality principle in the context of Goblin economics deserves extended examination because it is the principle that most determines the political implications of Goblin financial power. Gringotts serves all clients. During wartime, both sides. During peacetime, families and individuals of every political persuasion. The justification offered for this principle is commercial and pragmatic. A bank that took sides would become a target for the side it opposed, threatening its physical security and its institutional credibility. The argument is sound as far as it goes. What the neutrality principle means in practice during wartime is that an institution controlling the financial infrastructure of the entire wizarding world provides identical service to people who are trying to destroy each other. The Lestrange family's vault, full of accumulated dark artifacts and eventually a Horcrux, was maintained and secured by Gringotts throughout the First and Second Wizarding Wars. The Order of the Phoenix's members could access their personal accounts, Death Eaters could access theirs. The financial resources required to sustain both sides of the conflict flowed through the same institution, under the same management, subject to the same institutional rules. Whether this neutrality represents a principled position or a shrewd calculation of institutional self-interest is a question that different perspectives answer differently. From a purely commercial standpoint, serving both sides in any conflict ensures that whoever wins, Gringotts emerges as the indispensable financial institution for the victorious party. From a moral standpoint, providing equally good service to people using that service to fund mass murder is not obviously neutral in any meaningful ethical sense. Goblins have not publicly addressed this tension. The institutional position is that the bank's role is financial management, not political adjudication, and that inserting political judgments into financial management is both outside the bank's mandate and contrary to the founding principles of the institution. What goblins themselves thought about Voldemort's political project is a different question from what the institution's policy was. The evidence in the books, primarily through Griphook's conversations with Harry at Shell Cottage, suggests that individual goblins had strong opinions about the Death Eater agenda and that those opinions were not favorable. Voldemort's ideology of pure-blood wizard supremacy explicitly categorized non-human magical beings as subordinate, which was not an abstract political position for goblins but a direct statement about their status. Griphook's willingness to assist with the break-in was not motivated by any sympathy with Harry's cause so much as by his desire to recover the Sword of Gryffindor, but his conversations with Harry include enough indirect expression of goblin political concern to indicate that goblins were watching the war with significant personal stakes. The economic disruption of the Second Wizarding War, including the period of Death Eater control of the Ministry, had measurable effects on the wizarding economy that flowed through Gringotts. Families and individuals who were identified as enemies of the regime and had their assets frozen or seized were denied access to their vaults under Ministry directive backed by Death Eater coercive presence at the bank. This was a departure from neutral operation. The bank was being used as a tool of political control. Whether Goblin management considered this a violation of institutional principles and was powerless to resist, or made a calculation that accommodation was preferable to confrontation, or some combination of both, is not documented in accessible sources. The practical outcome was that Gringotts' neutrality, which had been consistent across multiple previous political crises, was compromised during the most severe political crisis the wizarding world had seen in centuries. The craft economy that goblins maintain alongside, and partly through the banking function, is a separate dimension of goblin economic life that deserves note. The commission of goblin-made objects has been a feature of the wizarding economy for as long as goblin-wizard relations have existed. Families with wealth commission goblin craftsmen for items that only goblin craft traditions can produce. The prices for these commissions are set by goblins. There is no competitive market for goblin-made goods because no wizard craftsman can produce them. There is no regulatory authority governing goblin craft pricing because neither wizard law nor goblin law grants any such authority to the Ministry of Magic. Goblins charge what the market will bear, and what the market bears is considerable because what goblins produce is irreplaceable. The political economy of this situation is the same as the banking situation. An irreplaceable service, provided exclusively by a group with independent governance and its own legal traditions, operating within a broader society that depends on the service but does not control the service provider. The banking and craft functions together create a picture of goblin economic power that is much more extensive than the bank's role alone would suggest. The vaults hold the wealth. The currency management controls the monetary system. The craft tradition controls access to the most valuable category of durable magical goods. 3 separate and mutually reinforcing forms of economic leverage, all in goblin hands. The commodity trading aspect of goblin economics is something the Harry Potter books barely touch but that the structure of the wizarding economy implies. Gold and silver are not merely coin materials in the wizarding world. They are magical materials with properties beyond their physical ones, used in potion making, in enchanted object construction, in various magical processes that require specific metallic properties. The goblin position as the primary managers of wizarding monetary metals gives them significant influence over the supply of materials that magical practice depends on. Whether goblins exercise this influence actively in ways that affect the broader magical materials market is not documented in accessible sources, but the structural capacity to do so exists. The Gringotts fee structure, the rates charged to account holders for vault maintenance and services, is set by goblin management and has never been subject to wizard regulatory oversight. The books do not detail the specific fees involved, which is consistent with the books being written from the perspective of characters for whom vault fees are a background detail rather than a central concern. For wizard families with significant vault holdings, vault fees represent a recurring expense that goes to Gringotts rather than to any wizard institution. The aggregate of vault fees paid by all Gringotts account holders over 5 centuries is an enormous sum that has funded goblin institutional operations, goblin community infrastructure, and the accumulated financial strength of goblin society beyond the bank itself. The lending function of Gringotts, which is a major part of what most banks do and what most banks depend on for their primary revenue, is an interesting gap in the available information about Gringotts' operations. The books do not clearly establish whether Gringotts lends money in the way that a Muggle commercial bank does. If it does, the interest on those loans would represent an additional significant revenue stream, and the decisions about who to lend to, and on what terms, would be another form of goblin economic influence over wizard society. If it does not, the bank is operating more as a pure custodian and currency manager than as a financial intermediary in the commercial banking sense. The absence of clear information on this point is itself informative. If goblin lending were a major feature of the wizarding economy, It would appear in the books as background context in ways that wizard-lending relationships in real economies appear in fiction set in those economies. The relationship between Gringotts and wizarding commerce more broadly involves exchange functions beyond simply converting currencies. International merchants who sell magical goods to British wizarding customers need to convert payment received in galleons to currencies usable in their home markets. British merchants who source materials internationally need to convert galleons to foreign currencies. The volume of these exchange transactions, given the scope of international wizarding commerce, is substantial. Gringotts takes a margin on each exchange, and the accumulated margin across all international transactions represents another significant revenue stream. Whether the exchange rates Goblins set incorporate margins that favor Gringotts over clients, and how those margins are determined, is not information available to clients. Because the exchange rates are presented as the rates rather than as rates plus margin. The wizard families who use Gringotts have, in some cases, had accounts there for many generations. The longest-running accounts, those opened when the bank was founded in the 1400s and maintained by continuous family succession to the present day, represent relationships of considerable duration and, in many cases, significant accumulated value. Goblins managing these ancient accounts have, through the gobbledygook records, access to financial histories stretching back centuries, showing the economic trajectories of families over generations. The accumulation and loss of wealth across wars and political changes, the specific financial decisions that produce the contemporary position of each family. This historical depth of information about the financial lives of the most significant families in wizarding Britain is, when viewed as an intelligence asset, remarkable. No wizard institution has anything comparable. The Ministry of Magic can access wizard birth and school records. It cannot access the financial histories of wizard families in any systematic way without Gringotts' cooperation. The economic position of Goblins as a community, distinct from the institutional position of Gringotts as a bank, has not been fully analyzed in any accessible account. What can be said is that Goblin communities have, over 5 centuries of banking operations, accumulated resources through vault fees, currency margins, and craft commissions that should have produced substantial collective wealth. Whether this wealth is held by individual Goblins, by collective Goblin institutions, or in some form specific to Goblin cultural arrangements about property is not detailed in the books. What is visible is that Goblin communities appear to be economically stable, that the bank itself is very well resourced, and that the poverty that characterizes many non-human magical communities in the wizarding world is not a feature of Goblin life in the same way it is for, say, house elves. Goblins negotiated a position for themselves in the wizarding economy that extracted value rather than simply providing it. And 5 centuries of that extraction have produced a material base for Goblin society that is independent of the political concessions wizard governance has refused to make. The question of what Goblins do with the wealth they accumulate through the banking operation is answered partially by the visible evidence of Goblin material culture and partially by inference. The craft tradition continues to require raw materials, workshop space, and the kind of sustained investment that ongoing craft education requires. Goblin communities that maintain smithing traditions need forges, fuel sources, and metal supplies that are expensive and require continuous management. The material base for maintaining those traditions comes from the revenues that Gringotts produces, distributed through whatever arrangements Goblin governance uses to support the broader community. The bank is not just a financial institution from a Goblin perspective. It is the economic engine that funds the continuation of Goblin civilization. The currency that Goblins produce and the craft objects that Goblin smiths make are the 2 outputs of Goblin economic activity that are most visible to wizards. Both involve transformation of raw materials through processes that combine physical skill and magical capacity in ways specific to Goblin tradition. Both produce outputs that are worth more, in the wizarding market, than the inputs that went into them. The difference between the value of raw gold and the value of a Goblin minted galleon, and the difference between the value of raw metals and the value of a piece of Goblin-made armor, are both expressions of the value added by the Goblin knowledge and magical tradition applied in the production process. That added value accumulates in Goblin institutions over centuries and is not accessible to any wizard government that might want to redirect it. About halfway through tonight's journey now. If this is your kind of content and you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. These lore-deep videos go up regularly and the channel is growing because people find them and share them. A comment below, even just telling us your favorite moment in the series involving Goblins, helps more than you might think. If you are already drifting, that is exactly the point. We will be here when you wake up, now, into the part of Goblin history that most wizards would prefer to forget. Chapter 6, The Age of Rebellion. The Goblin rebellions of the 17th and 18th centuries are covered in Hogwarts history classes in exactly the way that school curricula typically handle conflicts whose underlying causes the governing class would prefer not to examine too directly. They are presented as events. There was a rebellion. It occurred in a particular year. It involved conflict in particular locations. The Ministry of Magic managed the situation. The curriculum does not ask what caused the rebellion, what goblins wanted, whether what they wanted was reasonable, or why the rebellion stopped happening without any of those things being provided. The causes of every major goblin rebellion in this period are the same two things, in different combinations. Goblins wanted the right to carry wands. Goblins wanted their concept of property ownership to be recognized by wizard law. These demands were made before the first rebellion and after the last one, and at every point in between, they were never met. Every rebellion ended with some form of armistice that included wizard promises of review or reform that were not honored, followed by a return to conditions that were essentially unchanged from those that had caused the conflict. The only thing that changed definitively across the period of the rebellions was Goblin strategic thinking, which shifted from periodic armed conflict to permanent institutional leverage as the preferred mode of applying pressure. The Rebellion of 1612, which Hogwarts textbooks identify with a year and a brief descriptive sentence, arose from a specific incident that shows exactly how wizard-goblin relations broke down in this period. A goblin craftsman had completed a commissioned piece of work for a ministry official. The payment arrangement included a wand as partial consideration. The goblin received the wand, used it for a short period in his work, and was subsequently arrested for illegal wand possession. The ministry's position was that receiving a wand as payment did not constitute authorization to carry or use it, because wand-carrying rights for non-wizard beings required specific ministry licensing that did not exist for goblins. The goblin's position was that the wand had been given to him in exchange for his labor, he had accepted it as property, and as his property, he had the right to use it. Both positions were internally consistent given their respective legal frameworks. The ministry was applying wizard law, which had established wand restrictions on non-wizard beings. The goblin was applying goblin legal principles, which recognized acquired property as conferring use rights without requiring external authorization. The conflict was not a misunderstanding that better communication would have resolved. It was a collision between two legal systems applied to the same situation, where the more powerful party had the means to enforce its legal framework and the less powerful party did not. The rebellion that grew out of this incident lasted several years, involved organized goblin military action in multiple parts of Britain, and produced real casualties on both sides. The settlement, when it came, included ministry pledges to reconsider wand legislation in a formal review process. The review was conducted. It produced no changes to the legislation. Within a decade of the settlement, the specific craftsman whose arrest had precipitated the rebellion was dead. The pledges were buried in committee reports, and the wand prohibition was intact. The rebellion of 1752 followed a different triggering event, but the same structural logic. The specific conflict in this case concerned a collection of items that the ministry had classified as wizard estate property for succession purposes, following the death of a wizard collector who had purchased goblin-made pieces over many years. The goblin craftsmen's families, applying goblin property law, maintained that the items had never been sold in the sense that goblin law recognized. They had been leased to the collector for his lifetime, and his death triggered their reversion to goblin ownership. Wizard succession law, which governed the estate, recognized the purchase as a permanent transfer and passed the items to the collector's heirs. The two legal frameworks produced directly contradictory conclusions about who owned the same set of objects. There was no adjudication mechanism designed to resolve this kind of conflict. Because wizard law did not recognize goblin property law as legally relevant, and goblin law did not recognize wizard succession law as having authority over goblin property. Whichever framework was applied would be applied unilaterally. Wizard courts applied wizard law, which meant the heirs kept the objects. Goblins rejected this outcome as a theft they were powerless to prevent through legal means, which meant conflict was the remaining option. This rebellion was more prolonged and militarily more sophisticated than the 1612 one. The intervening century and a half of political frustration had produced goblin leadership that took a longer strategic view and goblin communities that had developed more organized martial traditions, partly in response to the experience of the earlier conflict. The ministry was simultaneously managing several other crises and could not give the goblin conflict its full resources. The settlement that ended this rebellion established a formal committee for goblin liaison designed to create a structured channel through which goblin grievances could be heard by wizard government. The committee was not given binding legislative authority. It could not change laws. It could not compel ministry action. It was a listening mechanism, staffed on the wizard side by officials who tended to treat the position as a minor career posting, and on the goblin side by representatives who presented their case knowing it would be heard and not acted on. The pattern was established and repeated across multiple, smaller conflicts throughout the 1700s. Grievance, conflict, settlement with promises, promises unfulfilled, return to baseline conditions. What changed over this period was not the substance of the resolution, but the goblin assessment of what could be achieved through open conflict versus what could be achieved through institutional leverage. By the end of the major rebellion period, a shift was visible in goblin strategic positioning that was not articulated as policy in any accessible document, but is evident in the history of what goblins did and did not do in subsequent decades. Open military rebellion produced high goblin casualties, temporary disruption to wizard political life, cosmetic concessions, and eventual return to status quo. The bank, by contrast, produced ongoing financial power, no goblin casualties, and structural leverage over every wizard institution that could not be withdrawn without destroying the economic foundation of the very society that might try to withdraw it. Armed conflict and financial control are different instruments for pursuing similar goals, and the Goblin strategic shift in this period was away from the instrument that had produced consistently poor returns toward the instrument that had not yet been fully exploited. This shift is sometimes described in wizard historical accounts as the end of Goblin militancy, as though goblins had given up the fight and accepted a subordinate position in wizarding society. This description is convenient for wizard governance and inaccurate. Goblins did not stop fighting. They stopped fighting with weapons because weapons had not worked, and consolidated around an institution whose power was structural rather than kinetic, and therefore much harder to address through military or legislative means. The patience required to maintain that position, to continue providing excellent banking service to a society that had consistently denied goblin rights while waiting for the moment when the full weight of goblin leverage would become relevant, is extraordinary. Goblins are, in political time terms, considerably more patient than wizards are. The histories of individual goblin leaders from this period are preserved in gobbledygook documentation within Gringotts and in goblin oral tradition, but are not available in any wizard-accessible source. What can be inferred from the progression of events is that the goblin leadership that emerged from the rebellion period had developed a clear-eyed and long-horizon view of the goblin political situation. The immediate fights were not winnable, the structural fight was already being won, and the way to win it was to make Gringotts so essential to wizarding society that the question of goblin rights would eventually have to be addressed by any wizard government that wanted to maintain access to the institution that made wizard governance financially possible. The Hogwarts curriculum's treatment of the Goblin rebellions as concluded historical events misses the most significant feature of the period. The conflicts did not end because goblins won or lost. They ended because goblins changed strategies. The underlying demand for genuine legal recognition and the rights that should come with it remained exactly what it had been when the first rebellion began. It remained unanswered. It remains unanswered today. The economic dimension of the rebellions is something the Hogwarts history curriculum does not address at all, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging the structural relationship between goblin-provided financial services and the ability of wizard governance to function. During each of the major rebellion periods, the question of whether Gringotts would continue to operate normally or would be affected by goblin community mobilization was a real operational concern for wizard governance. The bank was large enough and old enough by the time of the 1612 rebellion that its disruption would have caused significant economic problems, and wizard governance knew this. The speed with which the first armistice was reached, and the seriousness of the promises made during that armistice even if they were not honored afterward, reflects in part the pressure from wizard economic stakeholders who had no direct interest in the political dispute but very direct interest in continued access to their vaults. Whether goblin leadership used this economic leverage explicitly during the rebellion negotiations is not documented in sources accessible to outside parties. The pattern of the armistice terms suggests that goblin negotiators were aware of their bargaining position. The promises extracted, formal review processes for wand legislation and property law, the establishment of the Goblin Liaison Committee were specific institutional commitments rather than vague assurances, even if they were never honored in practice. This specificity is consistent with negotiators who understood that what they were trading, the resumption of normal banking operations, was worth specific institutional commitments in return. The economic disruption that each rebellion caused in the broader wizarding economy extended beyond the direct effects on banking. Goblin craft commissions were suspended during active conflict. Trade with goblin commercial networks, which existed alongside but separate from the banking function, was disrupted. The psychological effect on wizard commerce of uncertainty about the stability of the financial system was itself economically costly in ways that are difficult to quantify but was certainly felt. The aftermath of each rebellion included a period of economic recovery that added to the pressure on wizard governance to ensure stable goblin relations going forward, even if that pressure was not sufficient to produce the legal reforms that goblins demanded. The individuals who led goblin military efforts during the rebellion periods are preserved in goblin cultural memory rather than in wizard historical sources. The wizard accounts that survive tend to identify goblin leaders in functional terms as agitators or warlords or ringleaders, without the kind of biographical detail that would allow a full understanding of the political and military thinking behind the rebellions. What the pattern of the conflict suggests is consistent leadership that had clear objectives, maintained discipline over extended periods, and knew when the costs of continued conflict outweighed the benefits of holding out for better terms. This is not the profile of spontaneous uprising. It is the profile of organized political and military coordination under experienced leadership. The cessation of major goblin rebellions after the late 1700s was interpreted by wizard governance at the time as a sign of goblin acceptance of the political arrangements that had emerged from the armistice processes. The ministry's formal records from this period express something like self-congratulation about the effectiveness of the Goblin Liaison Committee in managing goblin concerns. This interpretation was wrong. Goblin communities had not accepted the political arrangements. They had concluded that the political arrangements were not going to change through armed conflict, and that a different strategy was required. The absence of rebellion is not the same as the absence of grievance, and wizard governance confused the two at considerable cost to the long-term quality of wizard-goblin relations. The legacy of the rebellion period in goblin cultural memory is exactly the opposite of how it appears in wizard historical accounts. In wizard history, the rebellions are periods of unfortunate disruption that were eventually managed. In goblin cultural memory, as accessible through what Griphook and other goblin characters reveal about goblin attitudes and historical narratives, the rebellions were expressions of legitimate grievance that were suppressed through a combination of military force and broken promises. The difference in how the same events are remembered by the two communities produces a fundamental difference in how each side understands the current arrangement. Wizards remember an accommodation that was reached. Goblins remember an injustice that was deferred. The specific organizational forms that goblin military efforts took during the rebellion periods reflect a level of coordination that the surviving wizard accounts, which tend to describe the conflicts in terms of suppression rather than political analysis, understate considerably. Organizing armed resistance across multiple geographic locations, maintaining logistical supply over extended periods, communicating securely in a language wizard authorities could not intercept, and negotiating the settlement terms that emerged from each conflict all required institutional capacity beyond what a spontaneous uprising would possess. The goblin communities that produced these rebellions were drawing on organized political structures, communication networks, and military traditions that had been maintained across the periods between major conflicts. The Goblin Liaison Committee that the ministry established after the 1752 rebellion, while not the substantive reform goblins demanded, was nevertheless an indicator that wizard governance took the coordination capacity of goblin political organization seriously enough to want a formal channel for managing it. An advisory committee is a way of directing political energy toward a structured process that can be managed and delayed indefinitely. It is not a trivial response. It is a specific institutional tool for containing pressure without resolving the underlying source of it. The fact that goblin representatives participated in the committee for decades despite its limited authority suggests either that they found the channel useful for intelligence gathering about ministry intentions, or that the participation was a strategic choice to maintain presence in wizard political discourse without reducing pressure in other arenas. Probably both. Chapter 7. Wands, Magic and the Craft. The prohibition on wand carrying for non-wizard beings is described in wizarding law as a safety measure. The language used in ministry legislation over the centuries has consistently framed the restriction as protective. A wand in the hands of a being without proper wizard education creates dangers that affect not just the being in question but the broader magical community. This framing does its work by locating the problem in the inability of the being rather than in the political preferences of the lawmaker, and by casting the restriction as a welfare measure for everyone involved, rather than as a constraint on a specific group's autonomy. The actual function of the prohibition is control. A goblin who cannot carry a wand cannot engage in magical conflict with a wizard on equal terms. Not because goblins are magically less capable than wizards in some absolute sense, but because wand-based magic is faster, more adaptable in combat situations, and universally recognized as the primary instrument of magical force in the wizarding world. A prohibition on wand carrying is, in practical terms, a prohibition on the most immediate form of magical self-defense available in any given confrontation. It places goblins in a structural position of physical vulnerability relative to any wizard they interact with. The symbolic dimension is equally significant and less often acknowledged. The wand in wizarding culture is not merely a tool for casting spells, it is the primary identifier of a full participant in wizarding society. Children receive wands when they begin their magical education at Hogwarts. Adult wizards carry wands as a matter of course. The absence of a wand marks someone as not fully participating in the magical world in the recognized way. To say that a being may not carry a wand is, in the grammar of wizarding social communication, to say that the being is not a full member of the community that the wand represents membership in. The wand prohibition is as much a social statement as a legal one. Goblins have never accepted this statement as accurate. Their objection to the wand prohibition has been consistent and clearly articulated in every rebellion period and every diplomatic negotiation for which records exist. The objection is not primarily that they want to use wands for magical purposes, though that is part of it. The objection is that the prohibition communicates something about goblin status that goblins reject. They are not subordinate beings who require supervision and restriction. They They are an independent civilization with sophisticated magical traditions, and the restriction on wand carrying is a daily institutional expression of a view of goblin status that goblins have never agreed to. What goblins do instead of wand magic covers a much wider range of capabilities than most wizard thinking about goblin magic acknowledges. The enchantments on Gringotts' physical structure are the most visible demonstration. The thief's downfall, the security systems in the high-security vaults, the properties of goblin-made objects, the tunnel architecture itself, all of these are products of goblin magical practice produced without wands. They are not inferior to wizard magic. They are different from it, operating on different principles that are not taught at Hogwarts, because Hogwarts' curriculum is structured around wand-based magic and does not have a category for alternatives. The metallurgical tradition is where goblin magic is most thoroughly expressed and most thoroughly documented by its results, if not by its methods. The process of making a goblin-made object, a piece of armor, a blade, a chalice, whatever the commission requires, is not a process of making the physical thing and then adding enchantments to it. The physical making and the magical embedding happen simultaneously, in the same motion, through a process that requires the craftsman to be doing both at once, in a way that has no analog in wand-based practice. The enchantment is woven into the structure of the material during the shaping process. It is not a coating, it is not a layer, it is part of what the material is. This is why goblin silver has properties that no other silver has. The material that wizard metallurgists call goblin silver is not a specific alloy whose formula could be identified and replicated. It is a product of a making process that includes magical components that are as much a part of the production as the physical materials. A piece of goblin silver that has been analyzed by wizard scholars shows a composition that can be described in physical and chemical terms. But, attempting to produce a new piece from those specifications without the goblin magical process produces something that looks similar but lacks the distinctive properties. The most important of those properties, the ability to imbibe strengthening substances without being diminished by them, cannot be measured in a piece of goblin silver that was not made the goblin way. It appears to be a property of having been made the goblin way, rather than a property of any particular material composition. The sword of Gryffindor's behavior over the centuries illustrates this. When Harry used the sword in the Chamber of Secrets in his second year at Hogwarts, he was wielding it against a basilisk. The basilisk's venom, one of the most destructive magical substances known, should have damaged or destroyed an ordinary sword. The sword absorbed the venom instead. Not because the sword was impervious to the venom, but because goblin silver, in contact with a strengthening substance, takes that substance into itself. By the time Neville Longbottom used the same sword to behead Nagini during the Battle of Hogwarts, the sword had absorbed decades of basilisk venom from Harry's initial contact, making it effective against Voldemort's Horcrux-containing snake in a way that it would not have been without that absorbed property. This behavior is not accidental. Ragnarok I, the goblin who made the sword 1,000 years ago, made it with this capacity deliberately embedded. The sword was intended to become stronger through use, through contact with substances that might otherwise damage it, through the accumulation of experience. This is goblin craft philosophy expressed in metal. A well-made object should not merely resist the world but learn from it. The property that makes the sword effective against Horcruxes is a property built into it at its making, not added later by any wizard enchantment. The other goblin-made objects that appear in the Harry Potter narrative are less central to the plot, but equally illustrative of the craft tradition. The goblin-made armor mentioned in passing in various inventories, the chalices and instruments that appear in ministry collections and private family holdings, the various pieces described as goblin-made in the context of valuable wizard possessions, all share the characteristic of being old, extraordinarily well-preserved, and in many cases still functioning with their original magical properties intact after several centuries of use. This is not typical of wizard-made magical objects, which tend to have enchantments that decay over time and require periodic re-enchantment to maintain. The durability of goblin enchantments reflects the difference between embedding magic during the making process and adding it afterward. Enchantments applied to a finished object exist in a relationship with that object that is always somewhat external, like paint on a wall. They can be maintained and reapplied, but they are fundamentally a separate layer. Goblin enchantments are structural, woven into the physical substance of the object in a way that does not degrade separately from the object's physical integrity. As long as the object holds together physically, the enchantments hold. A piece of goblin armor that has been maintained in good physical condition will have its enchantments working after 500 years, as they did when it was made. The craft training process within goblin society is, like everything else in goblin institutional life, maintained in gobbledygook and not available to outside examination. What can be inferred is that it is long, that it involves both physical metalworking skills and magical practice developed in parallel, and that the goblin who emerges from it is a practitioner of a tradition that no wizard educational institution teaches or could teach without fundamentally rebuilding its curriculum around principles that wizard magical theory currently does not have a framework for. The specific range of objects that Goblin craftsmen have produced across the centuries is broader than the Harry Potter narrative makes immediately apparent. The Sword of Gryffindor is the most prominent example because it appears in the plot of multiple books and its properties are relevant to the series' central conflict. But Goblin craft commissions across 5 centuries of wizarding Britain produced a wide range of items: ceremonial armor for prominent wizarding families, goblets and chalices used in significant wizarding events, containers with specific preservation properties for storage of potions and magical materials, tools with specialized functions for magical operations, decorative objects with lasting enchantments used in significant wizard buildings. Many of these items are now in private collections, in ministry custody, in Hogwarts storage, in the collections of various wizarding institutions across Britain and Europe, and all of them, under Goblin property law, carry reversion claims that have never been legally adjudicated. The helmet of Theodric, mentioned in passing in wizarding historical accounts as an example of legendary Goblin craftsmanship, represents a category of Goblin-made object whose specific properties are not fully documented in accessible sources. The historical accounts describe it as a protective piece with enchantments that have not degraded in several centuries and that provide capabilities beyond what wizard-made armor of comparable construction would offer. Its current location is described variously as in ministry custody, in a private collection, or as lost, depending on which account you consult. The discrepancy in accounts is itself a symptom of the larger Goblin wizard property issue. Objects of disputed ownership sometimes develop disputed location histories because parties with different ownership claims have different incentives to track and document their whereabouts. The relationship between Goblin craft traditions and wand-based magical practice is interesting from a purely theoretical perspective. Wizard enchantment theory, as taught at Hogwarts, involves the application of magical intent through a wand to an existing object or situation. The wand is the instrument, the wizard is the practitioner, and the object or situation is the target of the enchantment. In Goblin metallurgical practice, there is no equivalent of the wand as instrument. The craftsman's hands, tools, and magical capacity act together in the making process in a way that does not map onto the wizard model of a practitioner using an instrument on a separate target. The philosophical question of whether this means Goblin magic is a different kind of magic or merely a different application of the same underlying magical capability is one that wizard magical theorists have not resolved, partly because they have not had access to enough information about Goblin practice to investigate it properly, and partly because Goblin practitioners have not chosen to provide that access. What the results suggest is that both the capability and the application are genuinely different. The properties produced by Goblin craft that cannot be replicated by wizard enchantment are not simply products of a more skilled application of familiar techniques. The ability to imbibe strengthening substances, the specific durability of Goblin silver, the long-term stability of Goblin enchantments without maintenance. These are properties that wizard enchantment theory does not predict and cannot produce through more careful application of its standard methods. Either Goblin magic accesses properties of magic that wizard theory has not identified, or it achieves through a different approach the kinds of results that wizard theory in principle acknowledges but in practice cannot reach. Either way, the gap between what Goblins can produce and what wizards can produce in the craft domain is not a gap of degree, it is a gap of kind. The political implications of this capability gap are worth considering alongside the political implications of the wand prohibition. Wizard governance has maintained the wand prohibition partly on the logic that it prevents Goblins from accessing wizard-style offensive magical capability. This logic treats the wand as the primary source of Goblin magical potential threat. But the more significant magical capability that Goblins possess, the one that wizard governance has never found a way to legislate around, is precisely the craft tradition that produces Goblin-made objects. A Goblin with a wand can challenge a wizard in a duel. A Goblin without a wand but with 5 centuries of craft tradition and the institutional infrastructure of the world's primary banking institution is in a stronger position than any dueling capability would provide. The wand prohibition addresses a real but secondary concern, while leaving the more substantial Goblin capability entirely untouched. The broader tradition of Goblin-made objects in the wizarding world, beyond the examples that appear in the Harry Potter narrative, can be partially inferred from the way those objects are described when they do appear. The word Goblin made in the context of a wizarding object functions as a quality marker that does not require further specification. When an object is identified as Goblin made in the books, the identification itself communicates that the object has properties that wizard-made equivalents do not, that it is old or likely to last, and that whatever it was made to do, it does more reliably than alternatives. This is the reputation of 5 centuries of craft tradition operating as shorthand in the broader wizarding cultural vocabulary. The enchantment stability question that Goblin craft tradition solves is one of the persistent practical problems in wizard-made magical objects. Enchantments applied by wizard methods degrade over time. Some degrade quickly, requiring annual reapplication. Others hold for decades before significant degradation is apparent. Rarely do wizard-applied enchantments maintain full effectiveness across centuries without intervention. Goblin-made objects that carry centuries-old enchantments at full effectiveness represent a category of magical object that wizard practice cannot produce, and the demand for objects in that category, durable, functional magical items whose effectiveness can be relied upon over long periods, is a real and ongoing demand that no competitor to Goblin craft tradition has ever adequately met. The investment of centuries of craft knowledge in each Goblin-made object means that these objects carry cultural weight beyond their material value. They are evidence of a tradition. Every piece that survives from the early centuries of the banking period is evidence that Goblin craft practice 1,000 years ago was sophisticated enough to produce objects whose enchantments are still functioning. This is the kind of evidence that commands respect regardless of the political status of the community that produced it. Chapter 8. The Ownership Dispute. The most persistent and the most structurally unresolvable conflict between goblins and wizards is not about wands or political rights or official classifications, though all of those matter. It is about what ownership means. The two communities hold different concepts of ownership that are internally coherent and externally incompatible, and the conflict between those concepts underlies every significant goblin-wizard property dispute from the founding of the bank to the argument over the Sword of Gryffindor in the final book of the series. Wizard ownership law is recognizable to anyone familiar with Muggle legal concepts of property. When you buy an object, you own it. The purchase is a complete transfer of ownership. The object is now yours, to use as you wish, to pass on to your heirs when you die, to sell again if you choose. The person you bought it from has no claim on it once the transaction is complete. If you bought it honestly and paid a fair price, the prior owner cannot return years later and demand it back because they have changed their mind about selling, or because they now need it for some purpose, or for any other reason. The sale is final. Goblin ownership law operates on a fundamentally different premise. When a goblin craftsman makes an object, they own it permanently. They may agree to allow another party to use the object, to have it in their possession, to benefit from its properties, but they are not transferring ownership. The maker retains ultimate ownership in perpetuity, and that ownership passes to the maker's heirs or to the broader goblin community rather than expiring at the maker's death. When the possessor of a goblin-made object dies, goblin law holds that the object should return to the maker or the maker's successors. The possessor had a custodial relationship with the object, not an ownership relationship, regardless of what they paid for it or what wizard law says about the transaction. These two frameworks are not reconcilable through negotiation, compromise, or clever legal drafting. They are incompatible at the level of their foundational assumptions about what ownership is and what a sale accomplishes. Any settlement between goblin and wizard property law on this question would require one side to abandon a core principle of their legal tradition, and neither side has shown any inclination to do so over 500 years of conflict. The Sword of Gryffindor is the sharpest and most famous example of this conflict, and Griphook's explanation of it to Harry at Shell Cottage in 1998 is the clearest statement of the goblin position available in the books. Ragnarok I, a goblin craftsman of the late 900s or early 1000s, made the sword. By goblin law, Ragnarok owned the sword. Godric Gryffindor possessed it. Whether this possession was achieved through purchase, through trade, through Gryffindor's legendary courage being rewarded with the sword, or through what goblin tradition describes as outright theft is contested. Goblin accounts of the transaction say that Ragnarok I lent the sword to Gryffindor under specific terms and that Gryffindor simply kept it rather than returning it as agreed. Wizard accounts, to the extent they exist and address the question, treat the sword as Gryffindor's and do not engage with goblin property claims. After Gryffindor's death, the sword should have returned to goblin custody under goblin law. Instead, it became an artifact of Hogwarts, associated with Gryffindor House, stored in the headmaster's office, appearing to worthy Gryffindors in moments of need. For over 1,000 years, the sword sat in Hogwarts as a wizard heirloom while goblins maintained their legal position that it was their property being unlawfully detained. No wizard court has ever heard a goblin property claim on the sword, because wizard courts do not recognize goblin property law as relevant to disputes over objects currently in wizard possession. Griphook's demand for the sword as payment for his assistance with the Gringotts break-in was therefore not a negotiating position or a business proposition, it was a statement of legal right. He was not asking Harry to pay him something that Harry had full authority to give. He was demanding the return of something that, under the law Griphook recognized as authoritative, was already goblin property. Harry's difficulty with the situation stemmed from the fact that he also needed the sword for his own purposes and could not both give it to Griphook and use it himself. His solution, which was to agree to Griphook's terms with no intention of honoring them, was a choice to deceive a goblin in exactly the pattern that characterized wizard-goblin negotiations over 5 centuries. Promise, obtain what was needed, find reasons the promise could not be kept. Harry told Ron and Hermione privately, before the break-in, that he intended to give Griphook the sword at some point, but had made no promise about when. Griphook ultimately received the sword briefly before dying at Malfoy Manor. Whether Harry would have honored the agreement had circumstances allowed is a question the narrative does not answer. What the narrative does show is that the dynamic between Harry and Griphook, reproduced in miniature, the dynamic between wizard governance and goblin communities, across several centuries. Wizard party makes agreement, obtains goblin cooperation, discovers after the cooperation that the agreement is awkward to honor, considers ways to minimize or defer the obligation. The dispute over the sword illustrates the broader pattern because the sword is highly visible and has a traceable history. The dispute in the broader sense involves hundreds or thousands of goblin-made objects currently in wizard possession, all of which are subject to the same ownership claim under goblin law. Ancient pure-blood families that accumulated possessions over generations may hold multiple pieces of goblin work obtained under various circumstances, some through legitimate purchase in wizard legal terms, some through inheritance, some through means that are now difficult to trace. Each piece, under goblin law, carries a reversion claim. None of those claims are actionable in wizard courts. All of them are legally real in the framework that goblins recognize as authoritative. The accumulation of these competing claims represents an underlying tension in the wizarding property system that has never been formally acknowledged, let alone addressed. Wizard law treats goblin ownership claims as legally irrelevant. Goblin law treats wizard succession and property laws as irrelevant to the status of goblin-made objects. The two systems operate in parallel and in permanent silent conflict, and the resolution of that conflict waits on whichever side gains the leverage to make their framework legally binding on the other. Goblins have been accumulating financial leverage for 500 years. They have not yet converted that leverage into a property law reform. Whether they believe the moment for that conversion has not yet arrived, or whether they have accepted that it will never arrive and have adapted their expectations accordingly, is the kind of strategic question that goblin institutional thinking maintains in gobbledygook rather than in any language accessible to outside analysis. The question of what a resolution would look like, if both sides engaged seriously with the problem, is genuinely difficult. Full adoption of goblin ownership principles would be catastrophic for wizard property law, invalidating centuries of succession and inheritance based on wizard legal frameworks. Full adoption of wizard principles would be a permanent defeat for goblin legal traditions and would ratify centuries of what goblins describe as theft. Partial accommodation might be possible, a mutual recognition process for historical goblin-made objects, a reversion mechanism with compensation for current holders, some form of joint governance over disputed categories of property. But partial accommodation would require wizard acknowledgement that goblin law is legitimate, which has never been formally granted, and goblin willingness to accept something less than full legal recognition of their property principles, which their negotiating history does not suggest. The historical record of specific goblin-wizard property disputes beyond the Sword of Gryffindor is fragmentary, preserved more in goblin institutional memory and in gobbledygook documentation than in accessible wizard sources. What the broader pattern suggests is that disputes of the Gryffindor sword type, in which wizard possession and goblin ownership claims are both asserted over the same object with no resolution mechanism available, have been a feature of wizard-goblin relations since the earliest years of the banking arrangement, the 1400s, when wizard-goblin political relations were first being formalized, were also the period when the first disputes over significant goblin-made objects in wizard possession emerged in a formal political context. The founding of the bank and the property dispute tradition are contemporaneous, which is not a coincidence. The political relationship that produced the bank also produced the first formal arena in which property disputes had to be managed. The structural position of the ownership dispute in the overall wizard-goblin relationship is that it keeps the fundamental disagreement between the two communities visible and unresolvable without addressing the root cause. Every time a goblin-made object changes hands, every succession, every sale, every gift involving a goblin-made piece, the question of whose legal framework governs the transaction is implicitly raised. Wizard law treats the transaction as a transfer of ownership. Goblin law treats it as a change in custodianship that does not affect ultimate goblin ownership. Both parties to the transaction in the wizard world are operating under wizard law. The goblins who made the original object are outside the transaction, applying their own legal framework to a process they were not consulted about, and reaching a legal conclusion that differs from the one reached by both parties to the wizard law transaction. This triple layer of incompatibility, wizard seller's law, wizard buyer's law, and goblin maker's law all producing different legal conclusions about the same transfer, means that the ownership dispute is embedded in the normal functioning of the wizard economy in a way that cannot be resolved without either wizard law or goblin law changing at the foundational level. Every generation of wizards that inherits goblin-made objects from the previous generation is inheriting both the physical objects and the unresolved property dispute attached to them. The dispute accumulates with every succession rather than resolving, because no succession produces an acknowledged resolution, and every new holder of a goblin-made object is a new party to a dispute they did not initiate and cannot unilaterally resolve. The question of what the Gringotts break-in revealed about this dispute in Griphook's particular case deserves more attention than it usually receives. Griphook was willing to risk his life and his employment to recover the Sword of Gryffindor. He was willing to deceive Harry and to betray the people he had agreed to assist. The conventional reading of this is that goblins are untrustworthy and that Griphook's behavior confirms a stereotype. The more accurate reading is that Griphook was acting consistently with a set of legal and moral principles that he had held his entire life that were completely coherent within goblin institutional thought, and that the situation Harry had created made it impossible for him to honor, while also doing what he believed was legally correct. Harry was asking Griphook to help him commit a crime against Gringotts, and to accept, in payment for that assistance, a piece of property that Harry acknowledged he was holding temporarily, but that Griphook believed was legally goblin property. The combination of participating in a criminal enterprise and accepting property you believe is already yours as payment for that participation puts Griphook in a position that no straightforward ethical framework resolves comfortably. That he took the sword when he could and then alerted Gringotts' security is entirely consistent with a goblin who was prioritizing his legal obligations over an agreement he had entered under false pretenses. Since Harry's private communication to Ron and Hermione about not intending to honor the full agreement was a kind of pretense, whether or not Griphook knew about it. The aftermath of the Griphook-Harry dynamic illustrates why the ownership dispute is not merely an academic historical conflict but an ongoing practical problem that affects how wizard-goblin interactions actually unfold when they involve disputed property. Two people of good intentions, operating under different legal frameworks, cannot reach an agreement about an object they both have claims on. Because there is no neutral legal authority to adjudicate their competing claims, the result is deception on both sides, betrayal, and ultimately neither party getting what they wanted in a satisfying way. Harry did not keep the sword. Griphook had it briefly before dying. The dispute resolved in the worst way, by chance and catastrophe, rather than by any process that addressed the underlying question. The long accumulation of unresolved goblin property claims has a practical implication that becomes relevant whenever a major collection changes hands through inheritance or sale. Every assessment of a wizarding collection that includes goblin-made pieces involves a tacit decision to operate under wizard property law rather than goblin property law, which means treating the collection as containing permanently owned items when goblin law would treat it as containing temporarily held items subject to reversion. Auction houses dealing in magical antiques, estate lawyers handling the assets of deceased wizards, ministry archivists cataloguing historical collections. All of these professional contexts involve the same unarticulated choice. No one acknowledges it because acknowledging it would raise questions that no current legal framework can answer. The practical accommodation that has evolved is a form of mutual silence. Wizards operate under wizard law and do not acknowledge goblin property claims. Goblins maintain their legal position in internal institutional records and do not press it in wizard forums that would not recognize it. This silence is stable as long as neither side has a strong enough reason to break it. The specific circumstances that might break it, including a goblin political decision to press claims formally, a wizard political decision to acknowledge them through some legislative reform, or a legal test case that somehow reached a forum willing to consider both frameworks, have not materialized in 500 years of the arrangement. The silence holds because both sides, having assessed the costs of breaking it, have found those costs too high relative to the benefits available through confrontation. Chapter 9. The Great Break-ins. 2 successful penetrations of Gringotts within 6 years. No institution whose primary value proposition is the impossibility of exactly that can absorb this outcome without serious institutional damage. And the damage to Gringotts' security reputation from these events was significant, permanent, and unaddressed in any public way by Goblin management. The bank's response to both incidents was to conduct internal investigations, make internal security changes, and maintain silence toward the outside world on the question of what had been found and what had been changed. This silence is consistent with Gringotts' historical approach to institutional failures and is not merely institutional pride at work. Discussing security vulnerabilities publicly is itself a security vulnerability, and an institution with a 500-year record of confidentiality does not change that approach in response to a security failure any more than it does in response to a success. The first break-in, in the summer of 1991, was carried out by Quirinus Quirrell under Voldemort's possession and was targeted at Vault 713, where the Philosopher's Stone had been deposited. Quirrell was a Hogwarts professor with access to information about the bank through his professional position and his preparation for the year at Hogwarts, which gave him time to plan. The attempt was ultimately unsuccessful in obtaining the stone because Dumbledore had removed it earlier the same day, having been alerted to the danger through means not fully explained in the books. Quirrell searched an empty vault and found nothing. The partial success of the break-in, the fact that Quirrell reached the vault rather than being stopped at the outer perimeter, received less public attention than the empty vault did. The Daily Prophet's brief reporting on the incident emphasized that nothing was taken. The security implication, that someone had successfully navigated the tunnel system and reached a high-security vault without Goblin authorization, received less public attention. From a public relations perspective, emphasizing the absence of theft was correct. From a security analysis perspective, The more alarming fact was the penetration itself. What Quirrell used to achieve access is not detailed in the books. The mechanics of how he moved through the security layers, whether he had acquired legitimate access through some method of deception or whether the outer security of the bank was breached more directly, is not clarified in either the text or subsequent extended canon. What the incident established was that Gringotts' outer perimeter was not absolutely impenetrable, a fact that had theoretically been known but had never before been practically demonstrated. The second break-in, in the autumn of 1997, was incomparably more complex, more audacious, and better documented through the narrative perspective of the three people who carried it out. Its planning began weeks earlier at Shell Cottage, where Harry, Ron, and Hermione had been sheltering after their escape from Malfoy Manor. Griphook was also at Shell Cottage, having survived his own capture at Malfoy Manor, and the planning involved extensive negotiation with him about both the mechanics of the break-in and the price of his assistance. Griphook's value to the operation was his detailed working knowledge of the Gringotts security systems. He had been a Gringotts employee long enough to have detailed working knowledge of the tunnel geography, the security protocol structure, the behavior patterns of Goblin guards and other staff, and critically, the specific mechanisms of the high-security vault defenses, including both what they did and when they activated. Without Griphook, the break-in was a theoretical possibility with no practical implementation. With him, it became a specific plan, with specific steps and specific vulnerabilities in the bank's security that could be targeted deliberately. The central concealment mechanism was Hermione's Polyjuice potion disguise as Bellatrix Lestrange. The Lestrange vault was the target, and Bellatrix as a Lestrange family member had authorized access to it. A convincing Bellatrix could present herself at the counter and request vault access using the established process rather than attempting to bypass it entirely. Ron and Harry would accompany her as a prisoner and an attendant respectively, with Harry under a disguise separate from Polyjuice. Griphook would present himself as the Goblin escort. The complication that the thief's downfall introduced was known in advance by Griphook. He warned the group that the waterfall would strip their disguises, which is why he provided the means to redirect the water in the tunnel before the cart reached that point. The redirection was partial and temporary. It moved the waterfall enough that the cart could pass without the full effect, but it was not a complete bypass, and anyone paying close attention might notice the anomaly. This was the riskiest single moment in the approach phase, and it succeeded in the specific sense that the cart passed through without complete exposure of the disguises. What the thief's downfall did manage to remove, because the redirection was imperfect, was the imperious curse that Hermione had placed on Bogrod, the goblin assigned to accompany them into the high security level. Bogrod, freed from the imperious, was now accompanying them to the Lestrange vault under his own judgment, which meant the operational plan shifted from a controlled process to an improvised one. The team had a fraction of the control they had planned to have once they passed through the downfall. The Lestrange vault was reached, the cup was located in a vault filling with Geminio duplicates and flagrante heat, and Hermione eventually summoned the cup using a spell, while using a levitating charm to avoid touching it directly. A solution that worked despite the burns the group had already sustained from incidental contact with multiplying objects. Getting out was the remaining problem, and Griphook's betrayal removed one significant planned asset, his cooperation in the exit phase. Griphook took the sword and called for guards. The alarm went through the tunnel system faster than Harry's group could move. The decision to release the dragon was made by Harry, and the dragon's response, conditioned years of connecting the sound of swords on shields with incoming pain, was to accelerate away from the sound rather than toward the threat. The dragon went up, through the tunnel ceiling, through the floor above, through the main hall floor, and out through whatever architectural layer separated the underground from Diagon Alley surface level. The destruction to the bank's physical structure was significant. The emergence of a dragon through the floor of the main hall of Gringotts in the middle of a working day is not an event that passes without notice. And the Diagon Alley merchants and visitors who were present had an experience that featured prominently in their subsequent accounts. The dragon carried the three of them over London and out of the city entirely, flying north and east until it found a lake and landed, and they jumped from its back into the water. The dragon survived its captivity in the sense that it was alive and free after the break-in. It flew in a direction away from populated areas and was not reported again in any accessible source. Its condition, after years of underground captivity, with the long-term physical and behavioral effects of that experience, was not good, and its capacity to survive in the wild was uncertain. Griphook was captured by Death Eaters in the Malfoy Manor chaos a short time after the break-in. Voldemort, who had arrived at the manor after his own investigation of what had been taken from the Lestrange vault, killed multiple people in the subsequent events, and Griphook was among those present. He had the sword briefly. He died before any conversation about its ultimate disposition was possible. Gringotts' internal recovery from the break-in involved physical reconstruction of the sections of the building damaged by the dragon's exit, a security audit of every protocol that had been compromised in the approach, a review of what Griphook's access to security information had enabled, and presumably personnel reviews of everyone who had been on duty during the incident. The institutional response to the death of Bogrod, The Goblin, who had been placed under Imperius during the operation, is not addressed in available sources. What the bank communicated externally was minimal, in keeping with its historical approach to security incidents. What it changed internally is not documented in any language accessible to outside parties. The planning conversations at Shell Cottage, which stretched over several weeks, involved a level of operational detail that the books present in condensed form rather than at full length. Griphook's knowledge of the bank was specific and practical in ways that made him a genuinely unique asset for the planning process. He knew the schedule of guard rotations in the tunnel sections nearest the high-security vaults. He knew the specific detection properties of the enchantments in the tunnel sections between the Thief's Downfall and the Lestrange Vault. He knew the range of the Thief's Downfall's effect, and the specific point in the tunnel where a cart passing through would receive the full effect versus a partial one. He knew the behavior patterns of the bank's goblin staff well enough to assess what would and would not attract attention during what was supposed to be a routine authorized vault visit. The Polyjuice potion preparation required hair from Bellatrix Lestrange, which was obtained during the episode at Malfoy Manor when Hermione was in close physical proximity to Bellatrix. The preparation time for Polyjuice potion is approximately a month, which established a natural timeline for the Shell Cottage planning period. The quality of the resulting potion and the fidelity of the disguise were sufficient to pass visual inspection by bank staff who were familiar with Bellatrix's appearance, including goblins who worked in the area of the high-security vaults and would presumably have seen Bellatrix before. The disguise was not infallible. Someone who interacted with the false Bellatrix on personal matters would quickly notice behavioral discrepancies. The plan required the disguise to hold up for a transaction-focused interaction, not for any sustained personal engagement. The moment of the dragon encounter, when the group reached the section of tunnel where the Ukrainian Ironbelly was stationed, was less chaotic in the execution than the crisis-driven narrative might suggest. Griphook had told them about the clanging mechanism in advance, and they had the clangers ready. The dragon's response to the sound was what conditioning reliably produces. The behavior, the conditioning targeted. Retreat. The group moved through the section efficiently. What they had not prepared for was the state of the dragon's physical condition and the effect that its state would have on its behavior during the escape phase of the operation. The Ukrainian Ironbelly in question was a large specimen, even by that species' considerable standards. Ukrainian Ironbellies are one of the largest recognized dragon species, with documented wingspans exceeding 15 feet and body lengths that make them difficult to manage even in the wild without specialized equipment and significant magical capability. The one at Gringotts had been kept in a space that was adequate for containment but far from adequate for the animal's physical or behavioral needs. Years in that environment had produced a creature that, when the conditioning mechanism was overwhelmed by the combined stimuli of an escape opportunity, full daylight, and the sudden relief of spatial constraint, had no behavioral anchor remaining except movement away from everything familiar. The size of the dragon was actually what made the escape viable. A smaller dragon might not have had the physical capability to breach the bank's surface structure. The Ironbelly's mass and the speed it achieved in its panic were sufficient to break through architectural barriers that would have stopped a smaller animal. Once it reached the main hall, the vertical trajectory it took, up through the hall ceiling rather than laterally through the walls, was probably the most direct path to open air available to it. And the vertical exit through the hall, and then through the exterior of the building, brought it to Diagon Alley quickly enough that Harry's group could use its back as an escape vehicle before anyone on the ground had organized a response. The wizard response to a dragon in Diagon Alley was, predictably, chaotic. The Death Eater presence in and around Gringotts, which existed because of the political situation, was not organized for the specific scenario of a dragon exiting through the floor. Auras and Death Eaters in the area attempted to bring the dragon under control through standard dragon management spells, which were not particularly effective on a panicked Ironbelly of that size at that altitude. The dragon simply flew away from the situation, which is what panicked large animals tend to do when physical capacity allows. The subsequent reconstruction of what had been taken from the Lestrange vault was presumably a rapid process once the dragon had left the premises. The Geminio duplicates that had filled the vault during the break-in were, in Gringotts terms, a known phenomenon with a known reversal procedure. The originals could be identified from the duplicates through specific tests that Goblin enchantment knowledge provided. The cup of Hufflepuff was gone. That was immediately apparent from the magical detection systems that monitored high-security vault contents. Voldemort's reaction upon learning that someone had been in the Lestrange vault and removed the cup, which was to immediately check on his other Horcruxes, suggested that the psychological impact of the break-in extended far beyond the physical security breach to the strategic situation of his entire campaign. The lake where the dragon landed, and from which Harry, Ron, and Hermione swam to shore, is not identified in the books. The geography of their flight from central London, given the direction and duration, is not reconstructible from the information provided. What the landing establishes is that the dragon travelled far enough from central London to reach open countryside before its physical condition forced it to rest. The subsequent fate of the dragon, free after years of underground captivity but in a physical state that would have made survival in the wild challenging, is left open. It did not return to Gringotts. There are no subsequent reports of it in any accessible canon material. The most likely outcome, given what we know about the physical condition of a dragon kept underground without adequate space, light, or nutrition for years, is not encouraging. But the books do not follow up on it. The human cost of the break-in, on the Gringotts side, includes at minimum the death of Bogrod, the Imperiused Goblin, during the escape chaos, as well as whatever injuries were sustained by other Goblin staff during the dragon's exit through the main hall. Whether Death Eater personnel stationed at the bank were killed or injured in the same events is not detailed. The physical destruction to the main hall was substantial enough to require significant reconstruction. The combined human and physical cost of the break-in, from the bank's perspective, was the most significant security incident in Gringotts' 500-year history. Chapter 10. Gringotts under the Dark Lord. When the Ministry of Magic fell in late July of 1997, and Voldemort's forces completed their takeover of the primary institution of wizarding governance, the practical question for every wizarding institution in Britain was what the new regime meant for their operations. For most institutions, the answer was delivered quickly and directly: new management, new oversight, new political requirements. For Gringotts, the relationship was more complicated, because Gringotts was not an institution the regime could simply seize in the way it seized the ministry. The bank required goblins to operate. This was not a circumstance that Voldemort's forces could change by occupying the building and installing Death Eaters at the counters, though they did that too. The knowledge that made Gringotts function, the vault records, the security protocols, the enchantment maintenance, the cart system operation, the currency management, all of it lived in goblin heads and in gobbledygook documentation that no Death Eater could read without goblin assistance. The regime that took the ministry and changed every other major institution in Wizarding Britain within weeks found itself, with respect to Gringotts, in the position of needing to negotiate with goblins rather than simply overriding them. The negotiation produced an arrangement that the books give us only glimpses of through the evidence of the break-in itself. Death Eaters were present in the bank as a supervisory presence. Travers, seen accompanying the false Bellatrix and her group, was monitoring the access to the Lestrange vault in a capacity that seemed normal to other bank staff present, which suggests that Death Eater presence in sensitive areas of the bank had become a routine feature of operations rather than an unusual security measure. The bank was continuing to function. Clients were still accessing vaults, currency was still being exchanged, the core functions of the institution were operational. What this required from Goblin management was a form of accommodation with the regime that went beyond the neutrality posture that Gringotts had maintained in every previous political conflict. Neutrality, in previous applications, meant serving all parties equally and not taking sides. Under Death Eater occupation, the pressure was not for neutrality but for active cooperation with one side, allowing Death Eaters supervisory access, providing information about specific accounts when demanded, and operating in ways that served the regime's political needs, rather than its own institutional principles. The use of the Imperius Curse on at least one Goblin employee, Bogrod, during the break-in, reflects a form of control that presumably extended beyond that single individual. The ease with which Hermione was able to apply the Imperius to Bogrod, and the lack of surprise among other staff at Bogrod's behavior during the approach to the vault, suggests either that Imperius behavior was common enough in this period not to attract attention, or that the particular way Hermione's Bogrod acted was consistent enough with normal institutional behavior not to stand out. Either possibility is troubling from an institutional autonomy perspective. What goblins, who were not under the Imperius Curse, thought about their situation during this period is not accessible through the book's narrative. The books are written from Harry's perspective, and Harry was not inside Gringotts during the occupation period except for the brief duration of the break-in. What can be inferred from the evidence available is that Goblin management made some form of accommodation with the Death Eater regime because the alternative, refusing cooperation entirely, would have produced consequences for goblins that Goblin management judged worse than accommodation. Whether those judgments were correct, whether there was a path of more active resistance that would have produced better outcomes for goblins, is a question that the books do not explore. The financial implications of the occupation period for Gringotts operations were significant. Account holders who were identified as enemies of the Death Eater regime had their assets frozen or seized, which required Goblin management to actively deny authorized account holders access to their own vaults rather than merely failing to prevent unauthorized access. This is a reversal of Gringotts' historical function. The bank was being used not to protect wealth from unauthorized access, but to deny access to people with legitimate authorization, on the basis of political criteria that Goblin institutional principles had never previously applied to account holder relationships. The psychological and institutional damage of this period to the bank's relationship with its own founding principles would not have been lost on Goblin management. An institution that prides itself on serving all clients regardless of political affiliation, that built its founding agreement on exactly that principle, that had maintained the principle across multiple previous wars and political crises, was being forced to violate it systematically during the most severe political crisis the wizarding world had seen in living memory. Whatever Goblin management told itself about the necessity of accommodation, whatever framing was used internally to reconcile this period with the bank's stated principles, the fundamental reality was that Gringotts under Death Eater occupation was not serving all clients equally. It was serving the regime's preferences and denying service to the regime's enemies. The regime's interest in specific vault contents was also a feature of the occupation that the break-in reveals indirectly. The Death Eaters were present specifically around the Lestrange vault, and the Death Eater supervision of access to that vault suggests that the regime had particular concern about what was in it and who was accessing it. We know retrospectively that the vault contained a Horcrux, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, and that Voldemort's awareness that someone was interested in it was triggered by the break-in. The degree of attention focused on the Lestrange vault during this period implies that Goblin management was aware that the Death Eater interest in it went beyond ordinary financial supervision. Whether Goblins knew that the cup was a Horcrux, that Voldemort had hidden part of his soul in an artifact stored in one of their clients' vaults, is not addressed anywhere in the canon. The possibility is not far-fetched. Goblins with centuries of experience recognizing unusual magical objects and maintaining secure storage for dark artifacts might have detected something peculiar about the cup's magical signature. Whether they knew what it was and stayed silent, or detected something without identifying it, or noticed nothing unusual about it at all, is one of many questions about Goblin institutional knowledge that the books leave unanswered. The period of Death Eater occupation of Gringotts ended with the fall of Voldemort in May of 1998. The bank resumed normal operations, or as close to normal operations as was possible given the physical damage from the break-in, the death of at least one Goblin employee, and the institutional disruption of a year of forced political accommodation. The post-war recovery period for Gringotts was simultaneously a physical reconstruction project and an institutional recalibration. As Goblin management assessed the damage to the bank's principles during the occupation and considered what adjustments to make to ensure that a similar coercive situation could not be used to compromise the bank in the same way. Again, the question of what Goblin institutional governance looked like during the occupation period, what decisions were made by Goblin management and on what basis, is one that the books do not address from a Goblin internal perspective. Harry's view of the occupation-era Gringotts is necessarily limited. He spent a brief period in the bank as a disguised intruder and saw what was directly in front of him rather than the broader institutional situation. What the books allow us to piece together from contextual evidence is a picture of a bank that continued to function but was functioning in a context of compromised operational autonomy. The presence of Death Eaters in supervisory positions within the bank did not mean that Goblins had no role in the occupation-era operation. The financial knowledge was in Goblin hands. The enchantment maintenance was Goblin work. The vault management was Goblin management. What Death Eater supervision added was a political layer that overrode Goblin institutional decisions when the regime's interests required it. This is a specific kind of institutional compromise, operational control retained, but subject to political override from an external coercive authority. The bank continued to work because Goblins continued to work it, but it no longer worked on Goblin terms. The impact on ordinary Goblin banking staff during this period was presumably significant. Goblins, who had spent careers operating an institution that prided itself on principled neutrality and strict operational standards, were now working in conditions where the Imperious Curse was apparently in use on their colleagues and Death Eaters were monitoring their work. The professional environment was different in kind from anything that had existed before, not merely in degree, and the psychological effects on a workforce that valued institutional integrity would have been considerable. Whether any Goblin staff chose to leave during the occupation, to resign rather than operate under these conditions, is not addressed in the books. The continued operation of the bank suggests that critical mass of staff remained, whether that was from lack of alternatives, from collective decision that continued operation was preferable to the alternative, or from something more complex in Goblin institutional culture, around obligation to the institution, is not knowable from outside sources. The vault security operations during the occupation period faced a specific challenge that the 1997 break-in made visible. The Death Eater supervision at Gringotts created additional complexity in the security protocols, because the authorized access system now had to function in an environment where someone might have Death Eater backing but not legitimate Goblin protocol authorization. The case of Travers accompanying the group to the Lestrange vault suggests that Death Eater supervisory presence had been normalized enough that a Death Eater appearing at a high-security access point was not itself an anomaly. This normalization of Death Eater presence within the security perimeter was itself a product of the occupation, and it created a vulnerability that the original security design had not anticipated, because the original design assumed that the coercive pressure on the security system would come from outside it rather than from inside it. The Goblin management structure that survived the occupation period emerged from it with a different understanding of what the bank's institutional independence actually required to be maintained. The occupation had demonstrated that formal independence, the kind established in the founding agreement, was insufficient protection against a sufficiently coercive external authority. What the founding agreement had not provided, and what no subsequent revision had added, was any mechanism by which Goblin management could resist political pressure from a wizard government that had the physical means to compel compliance. The occupation was the proof of concept for the worst-case scenario that the founding agreement's neutrality provisions had been designed to avoid. The lesson for post-war Goblin institutional policy, whatever that policy was, would have been shaped by the specific experience of having those provisions fail. The specific experience of Bogrod, the Goblin who was placed under Imperious curse during the break-in, raises a question that the books do not address. What happened to him afterward? Bogrod was assisting Harry's group while under Imperious. Had that Imperious removed by the thief's downfall, was then present for the chaos of the Geminio-filled vault, the dragon escape, and the general security response. His fate during those events is not detailed in the books. Whether he survived the immediate chaos, and if so, what his account of events was when debriefed by Goblin security afterward, would be an interesting window into how Gringotts management processed what had happened to one of their own during the break-in. The broader question of Goblin staff well-being under the occupation, and what institutional supports existed for Goblins who experienced the specific kinds of harm that the Death Eater period produced, is one that the books do not address, because the books are not interested in the internal welfare structures of Goblin institutions. The inference is that Goblin institutional culture, which is old and sophisticated, has developed mechanisms for managing serious institutional crises because it has had to. The banking institution has survived multiple rebellions, multiple wars, and multiple periods of political pressure over 5 centuries. It did not survive those periods through luck or organizational inflexibility. It survived through adaptations that are, like most things about Goblin institutional life, documented in gobbledygook and not available for outside review. The Gringotts' position at the end of the war was that it was physically damaged, institutionally compromised by the occupation, and facing a serious security credibility crisis from the break-in. The fact that the bank resumed full operations after the war, apparently within a reasonable period, suggests that Goblin institutional resilience is real and substantial. An institution that can absorb a dragon exiting through its main hall, an occupation period compromise of its neutrality principles, the death of at least one staff member, and a break-in that demonstrated the penetrability of its high-security vaults, and then continue operating, has a quality of institutional continuity that is remarkable by any standard. The post-occupation period for Gringotts also involved a reckoning with the information that had been made available to the Death Eater regime during the occupation. Access to vault records that Goblin neutrality would normally have protected had been forced during the occupation through the combination of coercive presence and imperious control of Goblin staff. Whatever information the Death Eaters extracted from Goblin records during this period, about account holders, about vault contents, about the financial positions of families that opposed the regime, was information that would not have been available under normal operating conditions. The security breach was not just physical. It was informational, and the informational breach may have had consequences for people whose financial information was accessed that the post-war investigation of Death Eater crimes did not fully account for. Almost to the end now. If tonight has been good listening, a like on this video is the single most useful thing you can do to help the channel reach more people who would enjoy it. It costs nothing, and it makes a real difference in how the algorithm treats this video. If someone in your life would fall asleep better with this kind of content, share it with them. That is all we will ask. One more chapter to go. Chapter 11, After the War. The Second Wizarding War ended at Hogwarts in May of 1998, and the reconstruction it required was vast. The Ministry of Magic needed new leadership across virtually every department, having been staffed for nearly a year by Death Eaters, collaborators, and officials operating under various degrees of coercion. The Wizengamot required reconstitution, after a period in which its composition had been shaped by political purges rather than legitimate selection processes. Hogwarts needed physical repairs, the return of its teaching staff, and the re-establishment of educational conditions that had deteriorated to something close to institutional abuse under the Carrow administration. Dozens of families were dealing with deaths, imprisonments, financial losses, and the various forms of social and psychological damage that come with surviving a period of political terror. In the context of all this, the question of Goblin rights in the post-war wizarding world was not at the top of anyone's agenda who held political power and was not a Goblin. This is consistent with how urgency operates in political systems. Immediate crises generate immediate responses. Structural inequities that preceded the crisis and have been present throughout it tend to persist through the recovery period until some other moment generates political will sufficient to address them. The structural inequities in Goblin-wizard relations had preceded Voldemort by several centuries. They persisted through the recovery from his defeat. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who became Minister for Magic in the immediate aftermath of the battle, was publicly committed to a different relationship between wizard governance and non-human magical beings than had characterized the Fudge and Scrimgeour administrations or the Death Eater puppet government. This commitment was genuine. Whether it translated into substantive legislative change on the specific questions that governed goblin-wizard relations is less clear from the available record. The wand legislation, which is the single most symbolically important policy question for goblins, is not described as having been repealed or amended in any Pottermore material or extended canon covering the post-war period. The physical reconstruction of Gringotts was the most immediately visible dimension of the bank's post-war situation. The section of the main hall through which the dragon had exited was damaged in a way that required significant repair. The tunnel sections closest to the exit point were structurally compromised. The rebuilding effort, conducted by Goblin construction and enchantment staff using the same methods by which the bank had been built and extended over centuries, was eventually completed. But the timeline and the specific scope of the work are not a matter of public record, because Gringotts does not publish information about its internal construction processes, any more than it publishes information about its security protocols. The security review that followed the break-in was presumably comprehensive. Whatever vulnerabilities the incident had revealed, including the susceptibility of Goblin employees to Imperious Curse, the effectiveness of Polyjuice Potion, in combination with Goblin insider knowledge as a combination that could reach high-security vaults, and the specific weakness in the Dragon control system that allowed the break-in's exit, were presumably addressed. The specific changes made are not documented in any accessible source. The general principle of Gringotts security management, that the details of security protocols are not discussed outside Goblin institutional channels, means that any improvements made after the break-in are as opaque to outside parties as the original security system was. The bank's institutional credibility after the break-in presented a different kind of recovery challenge. Credibility of the kind Gringotts had rested on for 500 years is not rebuilt by constructing new tunnel sections or revising security protocols. It is rebuilt by operating without another incident for long enough that the successful break-ins become historical footnotes rather than current evidence. The break-in of 1997 had an unusually high public profile because it occurred during a war in which all information was politically charged, and the three people who carried it out were among the most famous individuals in the wizarding world. The difficulty of making that break-in into a historical footnote rather than a permanent mark on the institutional record is therefore greater than the difficulty following a more anonymous intrusion would have been. The conversations between Goblin representatives and the new ministry leadership about the post-war political situation presumably included Goblin expression of what had been done to their institution during the occupation year. The coercive imposition of Death Eater, supervisory presence, the use of Imperious curses on Goblin staff, the forced denial of account access to clients based on political criteria, the fundamental violation of the neutrality principles on which the bank's founding agreement rested, whether the new ministry offered formal acknowledgement of these violations, compensation, or any concrete adjustment to the legal framework governing Goblin-wizard relations as a result, is not documented in any accessible source. The pattern of previous such conversations, in which wizard governance acknowledged Goblin grievances without taking action sufficient to address them, is the historical context in which this post-war conversation should be understood. The broader picture of Goblin life in the post-war wizarding world, beyond the specific institutional situation of Gringotts, is not detailed in the books. The epilogue set 19 years after the Battle of Hogwarts shows a wizarding world that feels, in its surface features, very similar to the pre-war world. The Hogwarts Express runs. Families send children to school. The world is at peace. Whether Goblin communities in that world have seen their legal status change in any significant way, whether the wand legislation has been amended, whether property law has moved toward any accommodation of Goblin ownership principles, is left entirely to inference. The inference the history of wizarding Britain supports is cautious at best. Political will for structural reform tends to peak immediately following the events that generate urgency for it and decay as the recovery period continues. The 5 years after the battle would have been the period of maximum political openness to Goblin rights reform, if such openness existed at all. 20 years after the battle, with the war receding into history and new political agendas occupying the ministry, the conditions for revisiting fundamental Goblin-wizard legal questions would be less favorable than they were in 1998. The wizarding world continues, and Gringotts continues within it, with both parties maintaining an arrangement that serves certain interests and fails to serve others, exactly as they have been doing since the 1400s. The immediate political environment of the post-war wizarding world created specific pressures around the question of what would change for non-human magical beings. The war had produced a sharp contrast between what the Death Eater regime had represented, explicit hierarchical supremacy of pure-blood wizards over all others, and what the people who defeated that regime stood for. Harry Potter's specific relationships with non-human beings, his history with Gringotts, his relationship with house elves including Dobby, his interactions with centaurs and other beings, and the prominent role that non-human allies had played in the final battle, created a narrative context in which change seemed not merely possible but demanded by the logic of what the war had been about. Whether that narrative context translated into policy is the question that the available post-war material leaves frustratingly open. The political processes that produce legal reform in any system, wizarding or otherwise, require not just sympathetic leadership at the top, but sustained political will through a complex legislative and administrative process. Kingsley Shacklebolt's personal commitment to better treatment of non-human beings was presumably genuine. Whether that commitment translated into a Wizengamot willing to repeal the wand prohibition, or ministry departments willing to fundamentally revise property law in ways that accommodated Goblin legal principles, is a different question that depends on how much political capital was available and how it was allocated. The wand legislation question is the most concrete policy issue for Goblins because it is the clearest marker of their legal status and the change they have consistently demanded for the longest time. Repealing it would cost wizard governance very little in practical terms, because Goblin magic is already effective without wands, and the addition of wand-carrying rights would not fundamentally change what Goblins could do. What it would change is the symbolic and legal statement that the prohibition makes about Goblin status. For wizard governance, this symbolic change is the difficulty, acknowledging that the prohibition was wrong, and that the centuries of maintaining it were centuries of official injustice, is politically costly, even when the practical implications are limited. The property law question is more practically complex. Revising wizard property law to accommodate Goblin ownership principles would affect the holdings of a large proportion of the wizarding population, particularly the wealthy pureblood families, whose collections were most likely to include Goblin-made objects. These families, while politically weakened by their association with the Death Eater regime, retained economic resources and social networks that made them a political force in the post-war settlement. A property law reform that subjected their collections to Goblin reversion claims would have encountered organized opposition that was not present for, say, a Muggle-born Registration Act repeal. The other non-human communities that shared the political moment with Goblins also had claims that required attention. House elf rights, centaur recognition, werewolf protections, the status of half-humans in various categories of wizard law. All of these represented constituencies with legitimate grievances that had been exacerbated by the war. Political bandwidth is finite. The prioritization of which reforms to pursue first, and in what order, was itself a political decision about which communities' suffering was most urgent and which reforms were most achievable. Goblins, who had institutional leverage that other communities lacked, may paradoxically have been in a worse position to make urgent claims than communities whose situation was more visibly desperate. Because Goblin structural power reads as less sympathetic than house elf, suffering even when the underlying injustice is equally real. The 20-year period between the Battle of Hogwarts and the epilogue of the 7th book is entirely off-page from Harry's perspective. The wizarding world that exists in the epilogue appears functional, peaceful, and essentially similar in social structure to the pre-war world. If fundamental changes in Goblin-wizard relations had occurred during this period, those changes had settled into the background of normal wizarding life by the time the epilogue takes place. The absence of any mention of such changes, in the brief glimpse the epilogue provides, does not conclusively tell us they did not happen. What it suggests is that any changes were not prominent enough to be the kind of thing people comment on at King's Cross Station while sending their children off to school. The role of Gringotts in the immediate economic recovery after the war is something worth considering in its own right. Wars damage economies. The Second Wizarding War had produced a period of political instability that affected normal commercial activity across Wizarding Britain. Families with frozen assets had been unable to access their wealth for months. Businesses that depended on access to capital had been unable to function normally. The post-war period required not just political reconstruction but economic restoration, and the financial institution at the center of the wizarding economy was Gringotts. Whatever Gringotts' institutional relationship with the post-war ministry looked like, the bank was in a position of considerable practical importance during the recovery period. Unfreezing accounts, restoring normal access to vaults, processing the estate transitions of those who had died during the war, managing the currency implications of a period of economic disruption. These functions all required a functioning Gringotts in good relationship with the new ministry. The practical necessity of economic cooperation gave Goblin management some leverage in the post-war political discussions that might not have been available in less economically disruptive circumstances. Whether Goblin management used this leverage to advance the specific policy reforms they had been seeking since the rebellion period is the question the available record leaves open. The pattern of 5 centuries of Goblin political negotiation suggests that Goblin management would have presented their positions clearly and would have accepted whatever the best available outcome was, without abandoning the underlying claims. The best available outcome, in the immediate post-war environment, may have been informal assurances and improved working relationships, rather than formal legislative change. Informal assurances have the same problem in the wizarding world that formal promises have had historically. They depend on the continued goodwill of the party making them and do not bind future administrations. But informal assurances plus improved structural conditions may have been the practical maximum available in the political environment of 1998 and the years immediately following. The question of how the Wizarding World's narrative about goblins shifts in the post-war period is also relevant. The Harry Potter series ends with Voldemort's defeat and the implication that the Wizarding World has an opportunity to be better than it has been. Whether the community of goblins that operated Gringotts through the occupation, that managed the bank through the break-in, that maintained the financial infrastructure of the Wizarding World through 2 wars, received any acknowledgement for that during the post-war reconstruction is not something the available material answers. The books are stories about Harry, Gringotts' context. The goblin story that runs through that context, 500 years long and still unresolved, continues beyond the page. Chapter 12, The Hidden Power. The argument that goblins run the Wizarding World tends to be made in 2 registers. The first is the register of resentment, wizard characters who are suspicious of goblin motives, who feel that goblins have too much influence, who use the observation as a complaint about a situation they dislike. The second is the register of analysis, which is the register worth operating in, because the analysis version of the argument is not a complaint, it is a structural description. Begin with the most basic and most overlooked fact. Every galleon in circulation in the Wizarding World was minted by goblins. Not all galleons, not most galleons, not galleons produced by goblins operating under ministry supervision, all of them. The Ministry of Magic does not mint currency. There is no wizard treasury with coin production capability. There never has been. The decision to produce currency in the first place, and the decisions about how much currency to produce, in what denominations, with what properties, on what schedule, are goblin decisions made by Gringotts management under the operational independence established in the founding agreement. If Gringotts stopped minting galleons tomorrow, the wizarding economy would run down over whatever period it took for the existing coin supply to concentrate in fewer hands. And there would be no institutional mechanism for wizard government to produce replacement currency. This is monetary sovereignty. The term comes from the context of national governments controlling their own currency, and it describes the power to set monetary conditions for an economy. In the Wizarding World of Britain, monetary sovereignty belongs to Gringotts. The Ministry of Magic can set tax policy, can pass legislation, can maintain courts and an oral force and a Wizengamot, can do everything that a government does. But it cannot pay for any of it without currency that goblins produce. Every ministry budget is denominated in galleons. Every ministry employee is paid in galleons. Every government contract, every purchase, every public expenditure flows through a monetary system that a non-ministry institution controls. The wealth storage function extends this dependency into every dimension of economic life. The financial assets of the Wizarding World sit in Gringotts vaults. Not the assets of wealthy families only, not just ministry reserves, not only the holdings of businesses operating in Diagon Alley. The assets of every wizard and witch who uses the banking system, which is to say virtually all of them, are in vaults that goblins designed, guard, and maintain. Access to those assets is subject to goblin authorization. The keys that open the vaults are goblin products. The decision about whether a given access request is legitimate is ultimately a goblin institutional decision. In peacetime, these facts are invisible because the system works smoothly and serves nearly everyone's interests adequately. The ministry governs, Gringotts banks, wizards live their lives. The structural dependency that makes this arrangement possible does not require acknowledgement to function. It is there whether or not anyone thinks about it, the way gravity does not require acknowledgement to hold things to the ground. In crisis periods, the structure becomes visible. During the Death Eater occupation of the ministry, the fact that Voldemort's regime needed Gringotts to function, and needed goblins specifically to make Gringotts function, meant that the new regime had to negotiate with goblins rather than simply taking over their institution. The degree to which goblin management leveraged this need during the occupation, or was simply overwhelmed by a coercive force they could not resist, is not clear from available accounts. What is clear is that the regime needed goblin cooperation and knew it. The information question adds another dimension to the structural analysis. Gringotts holds financial records for every significant wizard family in Britain. These records are in gobbledygook, maintained by goblin staff, and inaccessible to ministry oversight without goblin cooperation. In the context of criminal investigations, political intelligence, economic analysis, or any other purpose for which financial records might be useful, the Ministry of Magic is dependent on goblin willingness to share information. What information goblins share, in what form, subject to what constraints, is a matter of institutional policy determined by goblin management, not by ministry authority. The craft tradition provides a third independent axis of goblin power. Goblin-made objects constitute the most valuable category of durable magical goods in the wizarding economy. They are irreplaceable. Their production is not subject to market competition because there is no competitor. Families and institutions that want goblin-made goods pay goblin prices, accept goblin timelines, and have no leverage over goblin decisions about what to produce, when to produce it, or whether to accept a given commission. The economic value embedded in the goblin craft tradition is enormous and diffuse, spread across the collections of families and institutions throughout Britain and internationally, representing centuries of accumulated craft labor, whose value is guaranteed not by any market mechanism, but by the fact that no one else can make what goblins make. The patient accumulation of all three forms of power over 5 centuries, without ever converting that accumulation into a formal demand for recognition, is the most remarkable feature of goblin political strategy. It would have been possible at various points in the past 2 centuries for goblin leadership to make explicit what their structural position implies: that the wizarding world is financially dependent on goblin management in ways that cannot be altered without catastrophic economic disruption, and that this dependency should be reflected in goblin rights and political status. This argument has not been made in any formal, public, confrontational way. Goblin political engagement has remained in the register of specific grievances and specific demands, the wand issue, the ownership issue, the classification issue, rather than escalating to the level of the structural argument. Whether this restraint is strategic patience, institutional conservatism, or an accurate assessment that making the structural argument publicly would provoke a confrontation that goblins would win in the long run but lose in the short term, is not knowable from outside goblin institutional thinking. What it has produced is a situation in which the wizarding world has been operating for 500 years on terms that are shaped more by goblin financial power than any official description of the relationship acknowledges. While that power remains, by mutual tacit understanding, unspoken. The goblins behind the counters at Gringotts count coins with the same efficient attention they have brought to the job since the 1400s. They look past the wizards who walk in, through them, at whatever is further away and more interesting than another client with a leather bag of coins to exchange. The wizards who walk in see a bank, a service, an institution that exists to hold their money and keep it safe. Both descriptions are accurate, only one of them is complete. What you walk past when you go between the bronze and silver doors, past the carved warning about treasures that were never yours, is a 500-year-old exercise in institutional power that has never needed to announce itself because it has never needed to. The announcement would be redundant. The galleons in your pocket were made here. The vault your family has used for generations is a goblin vault. The exchange rate at which your coins convert to something useful in another country is a goblin rate. The security that keeps your wealth safe is a goblin security. The poem between the doors was not carved for visitors, it was carved for the institution. A reminder, cut in stone at the founding and maintained for 5 centuries, of what the institution was built on and what it intends to remain, the place where what belongs to you can be kept. What belongs to someone else cannot be taken, and what the truth of ownership requires is never confused with what is merely convenient to claim. Whether the wizarding world is ready to apply those principles consistently, to goblins as well as to the humans who walk past the poem without reading it carefully enough, is the question the next 500 years will answer. Closing. The story of Goblins and Gringotts does not resolve neatly. Most of the major conflicts the Harry Potter series deals with resolve. The Dark Lord is defeated, Harry survives, the people who made the darkest choices are held accountable, some of them. The structural questions at the heart of goblin-wizard relations, who owns what, who has the right to carry what, whose law governs whose property, whose version of a centuries-old deal is correct, persist past the ending of the 7th book into whatever version of the wizarding world comes after. Goblins have been waiting for a resolution that satisfies them for 500 years, and they have managed their affairs with considerable skill while waiting. The bank they built has outlasted every political arrangement wizard Britain has tried. The currency they mint is the currency the wizarding world uses. The vaults they guard contain the wealth that funds the lives of everyone, from the oldest pure-blood families to the newest generations of muggle-born witches and wizards opening their first accounts. Whatever the post-war ministry has managed to improve in wizarding Britain, the structural fact at the center of wizarding economic life remains. Goblins built the financial system. Goblins run the financial system, and without goblin cooperation, it stops. Not slowly, not over years of decline, it stops. Everything else, every political negotiation, every legal dispute, every argument about rights and classifications, happens against that backdrop, and has been happening against it for longer than any institution in wizarding Britain except Gringotts has existed. The carved warning between the bronze and silver doors has been there since the founding. 500 years of visitors have walked past it and either forgotten it or read it as a warning to thieves. The goblins inside already know which every visitor will do. They always have. Rest well tonight. The 5-century track record of Gringotts, surviving every political disruption that the wizarding world has produced, is the most persuasive single piece of evidence for the structural argument. The Wizards' Council ended. The Ministry of Magic has come to within moments of collapse at least twice. Hogwarts has been occupied, threatened, and fought over. Gringotts has been robbed twice and occupied once, and it is still there, operating the same core functions it has always operated, under Goblin management, on the terms established at its founding. The resilience is not luck. It is the product of a structural position that makes the institution difficult to destroy without destroying the economic conditions that make the destruction worth attempting. Any wizard government that seriously wanted to seize direct control of Gringotts would be confronting the following practical problem. Doing so would require replacing Goblin management with wizard management, which would require wizards who could read gobbledygook at institutional scale, maintain the vault enchantments using Goblin magical techniques they do not know, operate the currency production system using Goblin metallurgical methods they cannot replicate, and manage client relationships across centuries of institutional history documented in records they cannot access. The seizure of the building and the vaults would accomplish the seizure of the gold that is currently in those vaults. It would destroy the institution that keeps gold coming to the vaults in the first place. The economic value of Gringotts is in the operational capability, not in any particular quantity of gold currently stored. Seizing the gold and destroying the operation produces a one-time asset grab at the cost of the ongoing economic infrastructure that makes wizarding commerce possible. This calculation is what has protected Gringotts from every political force that might have wanted to take it over more directly than the Death Eater regime's compromise arrangement. Voldemort, who was willing to take extreme measures when the benefits justified them, stopped short of directly destroying Goblin institutional autonomy even during his period of maximum political power. The compromise arrangement, in which Death Eaters supervised the bank's operations while Goblins continued to run them, reflects an accurate calculation that the bank's value required Goblin operational involvement. This was, in a very real sense, Goblin leverage in action. A regime that was otherwise disposing of human institutions entirely was forced to negotiate around the irreplaceability of Goblin operational knowledge. The long patience of Goblin political strategy, the willingness to maintain an arrangement that falls short of full recognition while building structural leverage across generations, reflects something about Goblin institutional culture that is hard to access from outside but is visible in its results. Human political movements tend to have shorter horizons. Campaigns for rights, justice, and legal recognition that do not produce results within a generation or two tend to fracture, lose momentum, or radicalize. Goblin political culture appears to operate on timescales that are not bounded by individual lifespans in the same way. The institutional memory of Gringotts carries the full history of Goblin-wizard relations in its gobbledygook records, and that institutional memory is the context within which each generation of Goblin management operates. The current arrangement is understood within that context as a point on a long trajectory rather than as a final settlement. Whether that trajectory has a destination that the wizarding world would recognize as just, and whether it arrives there through negotiation or through some future application of the structural leverage that has been accumulating for 5 centuries, is a question that the Harry Potter series poses without answering. The series ends with Voldemort's defeat, which is a genuine resolution of the immediate crisis. It does not end with any of the structural questions about Goblin-wizard relations resolved, because resolving those questions was not what the series was about. The series was about Harry. The Goblin story is something older and longer, and it continues past the ending of any story about a single wizard, however important. The Goblins at the counters continue counting. They have been counting since the 1400s, through every war and every political rearrangement that the wizarding world has managed to produce. The ledgers in gobbledygook stay balanced, the vaults stay full, the galleons keep their value, the carts keep running. Whatever conversation the wizarding world still needs to have about who Goblins are and what they are owed, Gringotts will still be there when the conversation begins in earnest. The comparison with other enduring wizarding institutions is worth making explicitly. Hogwarts is the most beloved institution in the wizarding world, the place that Harry Potter calls home more than any other, the school that has been central to wizarding life for over 1,000 years. Hogwarts has been threatened, closed briefly, occupied, and fought over within a single century. The school survived, but its survival required sacrifice and effort, and the active commitment of people willing to die for it. Gringotts' survival across the same period required no such dramatic effort. It survived through the structural logic of irreplaceability, and that survival was more complete than Hogwarts. The dragon exited through the ceiling and the vaults were briefly penetrated, but the institution never wavered in its core function. The Ministry of Magic has had its leadership decapitated, its staff purged, its highest offices occupied by Death Eaters, and its fundamental purpose as a governing institution temporarily extinguished. It recovered, but recovery required rebuilding from near collapse. Gringotts never came close to collapse. Even during the occupation, when its autonomy was compromised and its principles were violated, the fundamental functions continued. The currency kept its value, the vaults stayed sealed, the ledgers stayed balanced. What this suggests, when you examine the resilience of these different institutions comparatively, is that the most durable institutions in the wizarding world are not the ones that command the most respect or inspire the most loyalty. They are the ones whose functions cannot be interrupted without unacceptable cost to the people who might otherwise interrupt them. Hogwarts is beloved. The ministry is necessary. Gringotts is indispensable in a way that is different in kind from both of those things. You can imagine a wizarding world without Hogwarts, sad though it would be. You can imagine a wizarding world governed differently than the ministry governs it. You cannot imagine a wizarding world with a functioning economy and no Gringotts, because Gringotts is where the economy lives.